So in our recording, we're starting again next section on, I don't know if you can see this, my background wants to overlay it if I don't put it in front of my face. Contributions to philosophy of the event. This time we're dealing with the essence of truth section. So this is part 5, the grounding, section C, the essence of truth. Just that section is what we're doing. We were a little bit delayed in getting to it because I had some health issues and then there was some travel afterwards. Anyway, we've had a little bit of extra time for the amount of material, so I hope everyone hasn't forgotten it or got a chance to look at it again. I want to quickly cover what we're going to do next time, including schedules for next time. My plan is for our next session to be on the 8th of September. That would be 4 weeks from now. And the material will be the remainder of 5, that's time, space, and the abyssal ground, and essential occurrence of truth as sheltering. Those are the last 2 sections, D and E of 5, and then all of 6, the future ones, and all of 7, the last God. So basically we do everything up to the start of part 8, which is on the order of 40 pages of material. And the critical issues there that we did talk about is time, space, notion of time, space, and also this notion of the last God. There'll be several other things along the way, but sheltering, the future ones. But time, space, and the last God is the biggest 2 concepts we want to get clarity on in that section. And then the plan would be that we'll have the section on being, which is almost 70 pages. We'll split into 2 following sessions. So, and we'll get to that when we, what the breakdown of that is when we get there. But 2 more sessions after the one coming up in September should finish the book for us. And we'll plan to do that, basically be done by November. Is the current plan. So sometime between now and October, you should be thinking of things that we want to do next. Just throw that out there. Okay, but for this time, we're doing the essence of truth. And we're going to do our usual thing of round robin first reactions. You did do the readings, etc. When did you get to it? Things I should cover, and then move into sort of exposition on it. I'm going to let you guys take that. I just preface that a little bit by saying, in my own discussion, I want to back up a little bit and cover a few things from the very end of the Dasein section, which I think are necessary springboards into this. I won't do anything that's foreshadowing the next session, really, although to mention the time space idea. But there's some things at the very end of the Dasein section, which I think are necessary springboards to the essence of truth section. But the fundamental thing here is just the whole essence of truth section is what we want to cover. All right, first reactions and thoughts, comments, things we should discuss. Pete?
Yes, so I managed to read it. So some familiar ground. I liked entertaining the thought that truth is an event rather than the usual correspondence. I also noticed that with theses, the things lie before us, but Dasein stands in the clearing, and that seems kind of a foreshadowing of the fourfold, the having to stand. Not quite sure why the withdrawal, concealing, the clearing turns out to be so important. I don't remember what was going on with the Nietzsche bit at the end, and I was a little disappointed with the cave, Plato's cave part, that he just says, yeah, this will have to be developed as for the new understanding of truth and the cave, and he doesn't actually do it in this section. So that's it from me.
Okay, on the latter point, I mean, we're definitely going to spend, partly because I'm here, a fair amount of this talking about the sort of stuff on Plato in this section, including the cave stuff. For those who don't remember, in the Essence of Truth book we did together before, there's 2 fundamental sections of it, the section on the cave allegory and then the section on the Theaetetus. and especially the thesis of truth as perception and as opposed to right opinion in Theaetetus. That was meant to be kind of the place where he showed that Plato is at the origin of the idea of truth as correspondence, and debatable how much he showed that. We can debate that again. But here he's going over much of the same ground as he went over in that on the Essence of Truth book, at least in the sections where he's talking about Plato directly. Some of the stuff in the Essence of Truth book get into more detail on things like Zygon the yoke, or the analysis of the allegory of the cave especially. But it was already noteworthy in that book that he had this dichotomy of really liking the Plato he saw in the allegory of the cave, but then having all kinds of criticisms of the Socrates he sees in Theaetetus, with the same author behind both. But anyway, we'll talk about that when we get to the Plato sections. I definitely do want to talk also about the discussions of Nietzsche here, because there's several very critical discussions of Nietzsche, and then also a very sympathetic discussion of him that seems to still arrive at the point that he seems to have missed the point, something like that. But he's bending over backwards to be sympathetic to Nietzsche in a way that he is not bending over backwards to be sympathetic to Plato, and that's worth paying some attention to in this section. All right, good issues to raise. And as for the importance of the concealment, we definitely want to talk about that. I think there's some foreshadowing of that at the end of the Dasein section. I think also there's another in his base, there's an essay on the essence of truth in his basic writings, as opposed to this whole book, which is a shorter essay that includes like truth as errancy, that whole concept, which is, I think, quite related to this question of why is concealment so essential here? But we'll definitely talk about that. All right, good issues to raise. Joe, you want to give your first reactions?
I apologize that I haven't had time in the past month because of family issues, but I'm here eagerly to pick up what I might have overlooked, and of course to watch the video later. So thank you very much.
Okay, sure, no problem. Isabel?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I did do the reading some time back, and then I tried to read a little bit here and there. But as with Heidegger, I always find quite amazing that when I reread, I say to myself, did I read this before? It's as if don't recognize it, and yet I'm rereading. And then another thing I find as I study Heidegger a little more each time, it's that I find that what he says sometimes is quite simple. It is quite simple, but the point he's trying to make. So like Joe, I've had a lot of in these busy time of because of vacation and whatnot, and I will listen very carefully. I have revised my idea about fugue when I said way at the beginning that his writing is like a fugue. I hadn't quite read the book, but I now know that what it actually means. I, at the beginning, I had thought it was the joinings that were fugue-like. But no, this particular section that we are doing shows exactly what it is fugue. It is a fugue-like. It is that he goes into a concept and then goes back to the concept and back and back. It's the German word of wiederholen, repeat. So that in a way that's so innovative for us because we're so used to knowledge, discard, knowledge, or buy something, discard, or see a movie, discard. What's new? What's new? He is totally opposite that. And it's true, the insights that you get by going back to the same concept. I also want to take back what I said about the two Daseins. You said no, there are two Daseins, and I said no, no one Dasein. Definitely, the concept of Dasein falls into this. It's knowledge of Dasein. Go back, go back, and then we have a new look, a new insight. And finally, I've been also looking at other videos, and there's a scholar called Sheehan. I'm sure you are familiar with him. And when he teaches his students, he narrows down Heidegger to the 4 M's. Did you guys see that video? It's fantastic. It's recent. The 4 M's that explain Heidegger are meaning, motion, mortality, and morality. That, he says, is Heidegger in a nutshell. Anyway, I will be looking forward to the argument. And if I go in and out, it's because of the kitchen, the this and that and that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I, from my own point of view, would have to say that meaning and mortality are probably closer than motion and morality. But we'll get to some of those approaches to the morality question when we get to the critique of Plato and so on. Also his foils. There's lots of places in this section where he is explaining his views by setting them off against someone else for contrast. And you can learn a lot about what he thinks about things from, including those sorts of questions, by those sort of foils, those oppositions. Okay, Dan, first reactions.
Yeah, I read the book, and I read it, or the section, I should say, and I read it, but a month or so back, and I'm trying to remember now. I read a few other things in between, but I think a few impression is like, to me, this is quite central to everything, truth, and it's quite packed, and it needs a lot of unpacking, and the concepts are quite dense, and he's moving like this notion of truth is getting closer and closer to being, like truth is no longer is, it fundamentally occurs. And then he goes back like how everything failed, and you have all these nuances like they fail to like Aletheia failed, and how it failed, and how they move, like they forgot about the unconcealment in concealment, and then they saw it as this background, but the background, they saw it as a light, and then the light was in beings, and then it was in the medium, and then eventually move into conscience as reason. And it's like, it seemed like there at the very beginning with the Greeks, a lot of things happen, and they're very, very small nuances, but are quite important, and Heidegger is trying to point them to us, and it's quite difficult to follow at some point, and also fascinating. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is a very dense section. That's why I wanted to focus a whole session on just this section. I do think it's absolutely critical. I think that's also this and the Essence of Truth book and essay are the places where he's sort of at the closest grips with Plato on the biggest questions, something like that. But there's another aspect of this section, which I can go back to something that Isabel said about recurring, meditating on the essence of truth and Dasein, etc., and recurring to it, repeating it. And that is that there's a significant portion of the material here which is just expounding his own view without giving history, right? This is, meant to be this core section on the grounding that is moving us, past Dasein to being, something like that. So you get straight his own view of things in many places, and then after he's given you his own view of them, then he'll go back and look at the history again, and there'll be places where he's picking through the history to see what was unthought in it, in the sense of, why didn't they see this thing that I see now, right? Where is the difference between his current Dasein view, his own, that is, and what was and wasn't seen in earlier thinkers. So there are definitely parts of this which are very much, his history of Western philosophy. There's places here where you can see this is what he's saying about Plato, and this is what he's saying about Descartes and the moderns, and about Nietzsche. And we definitely want to go through all that and unpack some of those things, because it's very dense historical critique, if I can put it that way, in places. I think it's fair to say, though, that the two figures that get the most length of attention here are Plato and Nietzsche, as kind of bookends of the process that he's discussing. And there's definitely a contrast with how sympathetically he treats Nietzsche at the end of it, despite finding his position ultimately unsatisfactory, dismissible, and whereas Plato is extremely critical of, for the smallest error, in spite of the fact that there's, especially in the allegory of the case section, quite a bit of commonality, quite a bit of sympathy could be possible there. Anyway, but I definitely want to do that history stuff, but I just want to also point out that besides the history stuff, he's part of the idea here is that in discussing the essence of truth, is that the essence of truth is something which has a history, it's something which has a development. But for him, it's not even just that it has a history, that it changes through time, but that it is at stake, it is up for decision. What the essence of truth is it's the field of battle, if I can put it that way, between the Plato's and Aristotle's and Heidegger's of the world. And he himself is coming down for a particular actual solution on that, or actual stand on that. And he is not just relating a history in which Plato and Nietzsche are the antagonists, and he is a mere observer. He's a full-fledged participant himself, right? So we should pay attention to the places where he's just giving his own view in his own name, so to speak. But okay, these are definitely great issues. We definitely want to talk through some of the details of the history, places where that may be obscure to people who don't know the history. He'll talk about truth as certainty, and you have to know that he's talking about Descartes, right? You have to see that the way he's using a few of the terms, making it very clear that he's talking about Descartes and the modern move here, things like that. Okay, so that's great topics to discuss. Jason Benton.
Yeah, I've been working with some of these other meetups talking about Heidegger, and I'm still stuck on this problem with the difference between being and meaning. So I'm still, because I know the early Heidegger emphasizes being, and I'm just assuming there's this transformation Heidegger tries to go through where meaning starts to become more of an issue. So I'm trying to, I don't know if I'm correct or not, but maybe this essay will kind of clarify that.
So the meaning is not a core thing he's talking about in this section. Truth is, and he's definitely moving from being to being now with a capitalized and with a Y in place of the I. So he's playing with beings, the being of beings, and being with a Y. So the being with a Y is kind of a new term of art here in this work. And that sort of transition we can definitely talk about here. But he's not explicitly talking about meaning here. The place where he is talking about things here which directly connect to the meaning discussion, though, is projection. He's always talking about projection, and this is a projection, or that is a projection, or the important thing here is to understand the projection, etc. So there are ways in which he is, in very compact formulas, referring back to a bunch of the methodological stuff that's based back in being and time, where sort of meaning comes up. But the connecting tissue here to track in our section is the places where he talks about projection. Why does that matter? Because the first of all, there's a kind of background understanding of both beings and methodology that you get in early Heidegger, but there's also there in Husserl before him, which is something like the following: that the objects that the consciousness intends to contemplate, it gets to contemplate, right? It's not mistaken about the things that it is trying to think about. It may misunderstand some of the relations, but it gets to try to think about the things that it is trying to name and think about, something like that. And a way of putting that in sort of more Anglo-Saxon philosophical terms would be something like the person who chooses their terminology chooses the reference of their terms. And you don't get to come in and critique and say that you don't get to use a word that has that referent. You have to substitute something from my theory instead of your own, right? That doesn't work. That's not how thinking works. It's not how terms work, something like that. And this is something which was already sort of, I'll put it this way, authorized by developments in phenomenology in Husserl, even before Heidegger starts writing. And how does that get used for this understanding and meaning business, or projection business? Well, the idea is that the notion here is something like the meaning that beings have for Dasein is related to the essential possibilities of Dasein itself, right? So the ways in which human being can be differently in the future, its possibilities to be in this way or that way, are the means whereby Dasein understands the contents of the world it interacts with. So the early formula for that is that Dasein is a being for whom its own being is at stake, right? It is in play, what its being will be. And that the terminology of that is that in the early Heidegger, I mean, is that Dasein understands beings by projecting upon its own essential possibilities, right? So this is where the projection comes in. Meaning and projections are related in that projection on one's own possibilities to be, that is how meaning discloses itself to Dasein. Okay. Beings are meaningful elements to Dasein as well, right? In the sense that you don't get intentional objects of consciousness without a possible, at least potential, meaning to Dasein. That's like a kind of thing you would see from later cogpsych. You don't have a video camera in your head that first sees the world blank and then assigns meanings to things. You see the things that are already organized as meaningful to you, and that are already meaningful to you because they are organized into their your possibilities interacting with them, with the possibilities of them being important to you, whether as aids or obstacles, etc. Things come to you freighted that way, so to speak. But what's doing that freighting? And the answer is projection on one's own possibilities of action or being, something like that. So there's definitely a connection between being and meaning in early Heidegger. None of those are being directly discussed here other than being and being with a Y, which is sort of a deeper layer than this meaning that beings have. But the term that is being discussed repeatedly here is projection. He's talking about the essential projection, and he's even talking about at the beginning of the truth section, we're talking about here something more complicated than usual projection. We're talking about projection of the structure of projection, something like that. We're trying to talk about the essence of truth. Where's that? I think this is actually, yes, this is on page 259, the very start of our reading. Second paragraph, the grounding of essence is a projection, yet what counts here is the projection of the very domain of projection. And the task is thereby an originary taking over of thrownness, i.e. taking over the necessity of belonging to beings themselves and the mode of thrownness into the amidst, a necessity which rises out of and together with the need for the projection. So the point is that there, the term projection is the critical word that's being discussed, right? And the extra thing that's going on, we're trying to talk about essence of truth, is we're not just talking about any ordinary essence, which already involves a projection, but now we're talking about truth as such, as opposed to this particular truth. And that means we're talking about the very domain of projection, meaning the place or site in which Dasein understands or has revealed to it truths about things that matter to it. And that is part of being in the realm where anything like truth transpires. And that is being in the projection itself, something like that, where he puts, as he puts it, taking over the domain of thrownness, where thrownness is the idea that Dasein is always already in a world it did not make. And it is, to put it this way, bound to its existence as it's there, which always has ownness as a quality. You're not an abstract mind, you're the particular mind you are, something like that. Does that help?
Yeah, and I'm also wondering about being with a Y. Is that meant to be primordial?
It's not necessarily primordial in the time direction. The reason for being as a Y, with a Y, is he's trying to talk about as an essential occurrence. So he makes a distinction earlier in the book and elsewhere, but especially earlier in this book, between two questions, the questions which he calls the guiding question, the question of most traditional metaphysics, which was, what are beings? What are the beings? To ti an in Aristotelian terms. What are the beings? And but he's trying to move towards what he calls the basic question, or the grounding question, which is, how does being essentially occur? And in that second formulation, being gets the why. So what are the beings is asking about the beings, and it's asking what they have in common. What is the being of the beings? That's Aristotle's question, so to speak, with answers like substance or matter and form or whatever. There's different answers to the question of what are the beings, but what are the beings is the typical metaphysical question that precedes Heidegger's question. And Heidegger is moving away from the question of what are the beings to a different question, which he says is the question of the other beginning, which is how does being, now with a Y, essentially occur? And the point of this is to highlight the, go to this way, the event-like character of being. And that by event-like character, I mean it happens in time, it happens uniquely, it happens once, right? There is something about truth, which is event-like in the sense that it is temporal, it is unique, it doesn't have to happen repeatedly, it's not a class, right? And if you like, this is a characterization of actuality. And so the extra thing that the Y has in being is it has this event character, it has this actuality character. It is not an abstraction deduced from something held in common over a class of beings like beingness was. So it's not meant to be a Platonic idea that is read off of a large class of instances as what they have in common as some common denominator. Instead, the focus is on the provenance of the actuality of the provenance. This is really occurring. This is actually occurring. This is occurring in time now once. And the truthiness, if I can put it that way, of what occurs once uniquely is the thing that the transition from beingness of all the beings as a lowest common denominator to being with a Y as essential occurrence is meant to underline. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up event. That I think that is important to his work at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, event is where he's moving towards as the attempted answer to the question of how does being essentially occur, right? So it's already partly contained in the formulation of the question. How does being essentially occur? Well, first of all, it essentially occurs. It has the character of occurrence, and that's going to mean that event is going to be the term that is properly characterized being with a Y. Okay. Okay, so that's just general structure. The whole section 8 of this book is going to be that being with a Y and trying to underline all that. We won't be dealing with that next time. We have one more section in between, but the last 2 sessions of this book will be all about just that being with a Y question, because that's the subject of the whole last section, part 8, and it's also meant to be kind of the culmination of the structure he's laying out here. Okay, good orienting questions. Jason, do you have any other questions about the particular topics in our reading as opposed to general, trying to get to grips with Heidegger and his zoo of concepts in the first place?
No, everything's fine right now. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right, so we got a bunch of things brought up that we want to get to. I want to rewind slightly to some of the stuff going on at the end of the Dasein section. And why do I want to do this? Because the kind of answer to the essence of truth question is going to be a contrast between aletheia and Dasein. We can see this already on page 261, from aletheia to Dasein, from aletheia to Dasein, right? And then aletheia and multiple sections on aletheia. But the underlying point here is that in this section on the essence of truth, he's trying to describe a transition from truth as aletheia to Dasein. The whole previous section was about Dasein. So that Dasein could be something like an answer or part of an answer to the question of the essence of truth is something we need to see is going on in this section. And it means we should, having seen that, go back and look at some of the other things said about Dasein in the previous section. Okay. All right. I think last time we talked about being away, and I definitely want to come back to being away, but I want to first focus on the Dasein and the notion of selfhood or the self in 197. This is back in the previous part of section 4. bottom of page 252, being a self is the essential occurrence of Dasein, and the self of the human being is attained only through steadfastness in Dasein, where that second, actually they both got the hyphen. So he's emphasizing that this is their being, with being as something undertaken, so to speak. And I want to point this out here. The selfness is something Dasein has, selfhood. And then on 253, he says that this arises out of the domain of what is proper. And proper meant, in the meaning of the word, proper means, assigning as property to. It also means proper for the domain of. So it's what's the point? The point here is that the Dasein as there is never a there in general, right? It has a domain of proper to it, right? So this is, if you like, related to what an early Heidegger is the discussion of authenticity, etc. But the underlying idea here, and we talked about this as the different levels of Dasein, he doesn't want this Dasein he is talking about as a self to be confused with an I, and he doesn't want to be confused with a human subject and a subject-object distinction sort of poles, right? The Dasein he is talking about is a kind of being. It's one of the ways that being occurs. And one of the ways that being occurs is as the being of the there. And when Dasein occurs as the being of the there, that there has selfhood. If you like, it is differentiated. It is individuated. It occurs uniquely. Okay. At the end of that section, he gives this formula. Selfhood is the trembling of the countering of the strife and the fissuring, and this trembling is seized from out of the appropriation and withstands the appropriation. There's a bunch of technical terms in that. I won't try to go through all of them, but I want to point out the seized from out of the appropriation and withstands the appropriation. What is this appropriation business? This is the idea that Dasein is appropriated by being. You need to see that appropriated means belonging to, means seized by, means taken control of by, but it also means proper to, becomes the property of, right? So this is the notion of something like, I want to put it first in psychological terms because I think that's easier for old-fashioned thinking to grasp, and then I want to move away from the merely psychological, but being seizes the mind. Being seizes the consciousness, right? It's not simply the consciousness, though, because that's part of the attuning of consciousness to the reality or truth in which it is situated. So this is not something simply psychological. It's part of, if you like it, it's part of the embodiedness of anything like Dasein, anything like minds, that they are seized by, appropriated by being. Why does this matter for the essence of truth? Dasein cares about the truth because that's what Dasein lives in. Dasein is an embodied thing, not a disembodied thing. It's not an abstract thing. Dasein has to live in actuality as one unique thing. And because of that, it is appropriated by being. It cares about the truth. It cares about the particular beings around it. It cares about the particular content of its life, because that is where it is thrown. Okay. But you want to think of that as there is a being, a beingness even, conferred upon Dasein, which is the second part of the hyphen, the sign part of the Dasein, which is being has appropriated Dasein. If you like, this is underlying the point we already had in being in time, that there are no disembodied minds, right? Minds that are actual occur as embodied, as in a truth, as in an actuality in which they are at stake and in which they are individuated. Questions about any of that? Was all this obvious reading through the previous sections or even in this section, or is this complete news to you? You didn't know that you were thrown as an individuated thing that was seized by. Okay. I want to.
Sort of assume that's the beginning.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Pete first.
The thrownness, you know, that's been there since being in time.
Yes.
What's kind of new here is, you know, he's now emphasizing the clearing more than he kind of mentions it in being in time, but now we're in the clearing, and what's actually new that wasn't in being in time is that this being, which with a Y, which in a sense is analogous to the clearing, also withdraws and conceals itself.
Yes, and we're definitely going to get
from-
to the different ways in which withdrawal and concealment affects Dasein even well before we leave the previous section.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that there's the focus on the clearing. I would even say some of the focus on being, as opposed to reading Dasein as being only ours, so to speak, as opposed to it being something which is part of being itself, if I can put it that way, is definitely a difference here from early being in time. But I also want to underscore some of the continuities of being in time here, right? None of the stuff about thrownness, none of the stuff about selfhood have been abandoned here, right? And that's why in this early part of the section, when he says the task of originary taking over of a thrownness, taking over the necessity of belonging to beings themselves, and the mode of thrownness to the amidst, that is very much what is going on in the essence of truth question. It's a taking over and owning a thrownness that was already discussed in being in time. It's trying to understand it better, try to understand that what that really is, something like that. But it's that's being understood better. It's not a deviation from that. Similarly, if we go to section 213 on 267, he talks about what is the question of truth about, and he says we're not just modifying a concept, we're not just knowing a history of its truth, but it's about a leap into that occurrence as a dislodging of the human being and its position amid beings towards understanding being as the event. It's about grounding the human being Dasein as the ground required by being itself for its own truth. The point is, for him, the question of truth is not just a question of historical interest, and it's not just changing a concept around to use the slightly changed concept for cutting slightly different cookies. It is about dislodging the human being into appropriately appreciated and experienced Dasein as the appropriate understanding in relation to being as event and the ground required by being itself for its own truth. What is it? What am I getting at there? He's talking about a change in human selves. He's not just talking about a change in a concept in history, right? So all the stuff he says about thrownness and authenticity and resoluteness and being in time is being invoked here in spades, right? The truth at stake is the truth that Dasein lives in, not truth as a concept in a logic seminar, as a value on a truth table or something. Okay. Sorry, does someone else have other comments on the part I said before? I think we got Pete's comment, but not someone else's. I forgot who it was. No? Yes? If no one comes off the mute button, we're going to go on. Okay.
Actually, I will say something. I was thinking, like, you know, these days I cannot think of artificial intelligence, and you know, they have these things that is the true is it's atemporal, is disembodied. There is no self. There is no appropriation by being, and I think what can you have true in something like that if true is coming from being, and we are as Dasein are appropriated by being, and how can we talk about true in such a context like this artificial intelligence talks these days?
So it's a fair question. I mean, the place where he gets closest to this in our section is on page 260, where he talks about the usual horizon of logic and the predominant thinking. And I'll get there as one of the foils here. But this is on page 260. He's talking about the notion of truth common in his time among, if I can put it this way, the logical positivists, right? And he says, here, truth is taken as an object of calculation and computation. and ultimate intelligibility by an everyday machinational understanding is claimed to be the measure. That's what's going on in that AI world, which is that ultimate intelligibility by an everyday machinational understanding is claimed as the measure of truth. And there's plenty of things here where he'll talk about, semblance, and there's different versions of what he thinks of as semblance and what Plato thinks of as semblance. So we'll also have to get to, but I think from Heidegger's point of view, there's no question that he would think of what the AIs do as being semblance in this sense. It's based upon a notion of truth that he's violently disagreeing with as this intelligibility by everyday machinational understanding as what counts as truth to the folks designing the systems, if I can put it that way. But okay, I think mostly here that's just foil. It's just a way of more clearly delineating what Heidegger is thinking by setting him off against some things that logical positivists at his time thought, or maybe some more syntactically and semantically oriented theories of truth in analytic philosophy might, talk about it as. Does that by itself dispose of what may or may not ever go on with anything like an AI that is actually embodied? Different question entirely. Don't want to go there, right? I don't think Heidegger is at bottom committed to any Platonic theory of what does or doesn't make Dasein happen, right? He's not trying to give formulas for what makes human beings special as Daseinness, something like that. And he certainly is not claiming that you can or cannot make a new one in other than the usual recreational ways, right? He's trying to talk about what we know about Dasein tells us about truth and being. That is his concern, right? So I think that the focus / question on human uniqueness, something like that. The uniqueness that Heidegger is concerned about is way more unique than, if I can put it this way, mere human uniqueness. He's not worried about the uniqueness of humans. He's worried about the uniqueness of you. Right? Even if there are AIs that think you're not going to be one of them, you're going to be the being that you are, that is a Dasein attempting to understand being, and you're going to live your life, not imaginary lives of future science fiction creations, right? So that's the truth he wants people displaced back into. Okay. Fair question, though. I want to relate this all to the next thing I wanted to make sure we covered in the previous section on Dasein, which is the discussion of being away. In section 201 and 202, we get this notion of being away, or das Weg, that's the away, which is the contrast to the there of Dasein. So Dasein is there being, and away being is its contrary. Okay, and there's authentic and inauthentic ways in which Dasein can be away. He calls it the more original term for the inauthenticity of Dasein, meaning that's what he used to call it in Being and Time. It can be in the manner of bustling about with objectively present things, if you would like, being distracted, but it is removed from the enduring of the there, and only with beings as things objectively present. What does he mean by this? He means that when Dasein is entirely taken with whatever distracting beings are in its foreground and never notices itself or the life it is enduring or the truth it is thrown into or meditates on any of that, but is just distracted by present beings, that is one of the manners in which Dasein can be away instead of there. Never your mind on where you were and what you were doing is the phrase from the pop culture, right? If someone is never paying attention to where they are, what they're doing, to the actuality that they're in, to their own life as opposed to dream lives, they rather think about, then they are, instead of being there, they are being away. They're not living their life. So, and that is still a mode in which Dasein exists, right? It's a privative mode of Dasein, of an inauthentic lack of attention to the uniqueness and selfhood that they are thrown into or burdened with or charged with by being itself. Okay. So this being away is kind of an updating of all the discussions of inauthenticity that we got in Being in Time. Okay. But the reason I'm going into this is I want to relate all this to the question that Pete asked about why is concealment so essential here. And the next section, 202, relates these two. The claim is that there is a form of away that is the extreme possibility of Dasein, that Dasein is always already somewhat aware of, and that Dasein is aware of being away in the various forms of death. This is on bottom of 256. If Dasein is to be genuinely grasped the first time, death must be determined as the most extreme possibility of the there. And then also at the end of, third paragraph in 257, he talks about the more originally being is experienced in its truth, the deeper is the nothingness as the abyss on the edge of the ground. What's the point there? The point there is that authentically and resolutely experienced unique existence includes being haunted by non-existence, includes the even a running ahead of oneself towards that, and a felt contrast between the there that you are and the away you could be. In the language of Being in Time, Dasein is a being for whom its own being is at stake, not just in its content, but in its being or non-being. Okay. So this was already there in the previous section. Why am I underlining it? Because this is one of the ways in which the concealment, oblivion, nothingness, the other of the open are involved in the truth that Dasein actually experiences. Dasein does not experience just the positive side of just things in the light and just a shining appearing of truths that it experiences, right? It experiences all those things as emerging contrasts out of a background darkness with which it is perpetually threatened. Does that make sense to people? So in the terms of the aletheia word, there is a lethe before the aletheia, right? The lethe is oblivion. The lethe is forgetfulness. The lethe is also concealment. The lethe is also the river in Hades where the dead go, right? And aletheia as truth is being in the light. It's also being alive, right? So in the lethe word, experience in the Greek language itself, even before it becomes philosophical, right? When it's still mythical, there is already this understood contrast about the word for truth. Questions about any of that? Okay.
Yes, I just point out one thing on 256, end of the second paragraph. The human being is the away, and then it has das Weg, and which also means you can split it a way, that the human being is on a path going somewhere. And Isabel brought up at the beginning one of the 4 M's from Thomas Sheehan talk on movement.
Yes.
And, what Heidegger means, he's referring back to kinesis in Aristotle. and how important that is. The truth is not static,
Sure.
but it's part of the event thing, and it's a movement that Dasein is involved with. It's
Yeah.
not something in a large language model
Sure.
stored away in memory somewhere. It's you're on the way to
Right.
truth.
So this is fair, but the term that he uses less here and more in the next this section, our section and the next section for this is transport. He doesn't talk about it as motion or kinesis. He talks about it as transport. And this is the just as there was an appropriation. There's an appropriation into amidst enthronedness. There is also transport. And what is transport being used for here? Transport is the on the wayness of Dasein. It is the fact that Dasein not only is in time, but it is not sitting at a point in time statically. It is always transported into its future. The future is always rushing at Dasein as, you know, the future that is being shaped towards which it is piloting and about which it is concerned, right? In some of the later sections on time space, he will talk about the moment as the bundling of the different ecstasies of time in transport. But the point is that throneness isn't just into a there, it's into a now. It's into the there in which it is a throne has this the temporal as well as the spatial aspect, but that is not just into a point in time as though it's statically there. It is always a transport. That's the term he uses here for it, for this this actualityness, this in-timeness, but this in-timeness is in a forward direction. The forward direction, though, as we just saw in the section on the away, is also running ahead toward death. Dasein is aware of its finitude in the time in which it is transported, right? It is not an infinite future timeline, right? And that again, it comes back to this contrast between the light of the arising appearing and the concealment around it. So yes, transport, but also transport in this rushing sense, in this rushed forward into the future sense. Now, Heidegger is at pains to point out several places here in the next section that these are not things simply passively undergone. When they are authentic, they take on the character of decisions. That's sort of the difference between resolute, he calls it withstanding all the time. Resolute withstanding of all these things is when they're your own and when you're deciding on them, as opposed to when they're just happening to you in the modes of inauthenticity talked about being in time. Okay. Why am I going through all this section on Dasein? Because these aspects of what would be called just existential reality that is the early being in time is known for are still very much present here in the Dasein he is talking about. And when he's going to be talking about the essence of truth and going from aletheia to Dasein, he's moving towards something like that existential situation correctly understood as being part of the essence of truth. Right? We're not just talking about abstract truth functions. We are talking about in put it in Gnostic terms, where we are and where we are going. Question, Isabel.
Yes, I have an observation. The minute you said running away towards death, remember my two loves are Dante and Heidegger, is that although you are taking the words from Dante, questo vivere che un correre alla morte, which is saying exactly what you said, running away, you run towards death.
Yes,
But,
he says not away, but ahead on page 257, as opposed to Dante's way of putting it. Heidegger says running ahead towards death.
Yes, that is different,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
About also, it isn't motion; it was movement. I'm glad Peter, Pete, corrected me. Yes, about mortality, we have spoken about. Rather, you have spoken, Jason, about the uniqueness of the occurrence, the uniqueness, the one time only, the event. And I was thinking about the way that Heidegger has given us a picture of mortality so that we do not feel morose about it, but that rather we see it as something that will shed light to our life, so to speak. But the mortality, um, joining these two concepts together, right then and there, it shows since only you can die your death. Nobody can die your death for you. He said it time and
Yes.
again.
Yes.
Only you can experience it. That right then and there, it shows how unique each human being is.
Yes.
And the uniqueness of the human being uh, uh, gives a certain light. And here you might then go into mortality, morality. If indeed you are one time only on this earth,
Yep.
one time only,
Yep.
then you can't go around following the day. You can't go around watching the next show on TV. You have to come to grips with your uniqueness. Thank you.
I agree with all that, except that I would substitute weight for light, because it gives weight. What he's exactly saying is that there's something like not just a light in the foreground, but a surrounding previous or underlying unseen, and that what he thinks that gives, for all the reasons you explain eloquently, is it gives weight to things. It gives weight to your life and the decisions of your life and what you spend your time on. It doesn't simply give light to them. Okay. All right. The last thing I wanted to make sure we talked about from the previous section before moving on to our proper topic is the projection in Dasein. So we've talked about all this Dasein as own and existential aspects, right? On the last section of the previous, section B, the projection in Dasein, it says the projection is first the between in whose openness beings become distinguishable from beingness, such that initially only beings themselves can be experienced. And then he's going to contrast it with the ideas. He also talks about how it is covered over representation. That's related to the critique of Descartes we'll get a little bit later here. And then also how the subject-object relation arises, and so does consciousness of the I represent. That's Descartes to Kant, basically. And then how in opposition life is emphasized. That finally Nietzsche reacts this way, the clearest evidence of the non-originator is questioning. In other words, there's a critique of everyone from Plato to Nietzsche here on this issue of projection as the first between in whose openness beings appear. And the way I'm reading this is the last sentence of the previous section is the program for what should be accomplished in the section on Dasein and the essence of truth. The task is not to explain the projection, but to transfigure it in its ground and abyss and to dislodge human being into it. There's a wonderful picture there of dislodging the human being into an abyss, into Dasein, and thus to show human being the other beginning of its history. So the point here is he's not trying to give a different theory about how subjective projection works or anything like that. He's not trying to explain how the movie projector that is throwing the flickering lights onto the screen works. He's trying to dislodge the human being into Dasein, into experiencing its life in the truth this way, in this appropriate way. We'll talk a little about the motivations for that in the coming section. But the point here is to see that the essence of truth question it has all these elements of historical critique of previous philosophy, but the underlying, put it this way, the underlying concern is practical in the sense that he wants the human being to be dislodged into Dasein and not to think of himself as the rational animal with these previous characteristics of previous philosophy had described to him, but to think of himself as their being in which is the place or site where the openness happens, being is unveiled, truth occurs. In other words, into something like a task as shepherd of truth or shepherd of being, as we'll call it later. Okay. All of that, I think, is just background of what's coming out of the Dasein section as programmatic for the essence of truth chapter. I'm going to give people a last chance to react to any of that before we go into the essence of truth section itself. Okay. So I want to emphasize that we don't go immediately to aletheia in the history part. The aletheia and history part does come in, and if I can sketch what the outline here, there's some intro sections where Heidegger is giving his own stuff in compressed formulas, and then he's going straight back to aletheia and the other beginning. He's going to give the history of the essence of truth, the crisis in Plato and Aristotle, the truth of certainty section, which takes up to the modern time. All of that, and later we're going to get a much deeper dive on both aletheia, Plato, and Nietzsche at the end of the section. But all of that capsule history, so to speak, happens sandwiched between the first two or so sections, the essence of truth and the open. And at the end of them, we get the question of what truth is about, where again, he's underlying, this is not just mere modification of a subject, he's echoing what he said at the end of the previous section about the practical aim of all this. Okay. My point is I want to put brackets around the history discussion. The history discussion is important to him, but it's not the point. The point is the exposition of his own view. And then when he goes through the history, it's going to be to see ways in which that history did or didn't get to his own view. What this means is that in these first two sections, 204 and 205, we can expect to get a very compact version of Heidegger's own view on the question of the essence of truth. Right. The first part is almost all, well, that's not quite true. The first part, a lot of it is critique of contemporary ideas, right? But the grounding of essence is a projection, the second paragraph there, which I've already read to you, right? And the last sentence, the essential projection of the there is the unprotected carrying out of thrownness that first emerges in the throwing, which echoes back to that paragraph. That's the part of this first paragraph, which is his own view, right? We're talking about unprotected carrying out of the thrownness. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about what he means by unprotected? Why is he calling this unprotected? Dan or Pete, do you have a thought on why he said unprotected here? No thought. Okay. He's just gotten through refuting a bunch of stuff from logic, right? Logic and systems are armor. They're protection. They're trying to think things that are buttressed around with rational argument and appeals to agreement and attempts to make something firm and constant in the sciences, as opposed to unprotected. Unprotected means venturing out onto the limb that could break off at any moment. It means exposed. It means in danger. It means sketching ahead, right? So it's not something which you can rely upon in a deduction from sound premises that you're sure is solid ground. It's tightrope walking, right? So the essence of truth exploration here is questioning, and it's questioning in an unprotected manner. It's questioning in a manner where you're not sure of the steps. Okay. And he calls that carrying out of the thrownness. So the point is the here and nowness uniqueness of the questioner, right, is unprotectedly at play here. Okay. So this is the farthest thing from an assurance that all of this follows so logically that the conclusion cannot be otherwise. At bottom, methodologically, he's appealing here to you to repeat the experience. He is not appealing you here to follow the reasoning, right? When he talks about displacing and dislodging into Dasein, this is proceeding by invitation to look where he's pointing, have the same thoughts, undergo the experience yourself, see what he sees, right? There are definitely parts of the critique, the historical critique, which are meant to be reasoned, which are meant to follow from things you can see in the sources, etc. But none of this is meant to be a systematic logical deduction from granted premises, anything like it. This is meant to be a sketching of how it looks to him that is an unprotected thrown projection. Okay. And then immediately having said that that's what he's about to do, before he gets to history, he gives you this one little section on the open. The open as the free domain of the boldness of creating, as the unprotectedness, the carrying out of thrownness, both belonging together as the clearing of self-concealing, the there is appropriate in the event, this free domain over and against beings, the unprotected through beings, the temporal spatial playing field of confusion and the intimations, that which belongs to being. All right. This is very compact. This is a very compact sketch, but it's a sketch of the terrain over which we're going in the whole rest of section 5, right? This part and the start we're going to do next time. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that the terms that are being referred to here are clear to everybody. Because if any part of this is clear, you have no idea what he's even pointing at. As the rest of the chapter, he's going to be trying to be arguing for these things, and he will expound them at greater depth and greater length and pull them out more. But if you don't even know what he means by free domain, unprotectedness, self-concealing, there, appropriated, unprotected again, confusion, playing field, intimations, he's speaking Greek to you, and you can't even see the things he's pointing at. So I'm open to questions on this section of the open. What terms didn't make sense to people? If everyone is quiet, I'm going to call on Joe because he knows he didn't get them all. Do you understand what he means by intimations? At the end of it. I take that as a no.
So he means hints, right?
Yes. But he also means the sense of things you don't quite get. He means the sense that there's a more, the sense that there's a behind, a felt unseen. An intimation is a attuned sense that there's more, and a tuned sense of a felt unseen. It's the sense of mystery you have in the early parts of the mystery story, right? You have intimations that more is going on, but you can't even latch them on to anything particular yet, right? Why does that matter? He's going to claim that the way in which intimations happen is part of how truth happens, or what the essence of truth is like. The essence of truth includes mystery. The essence of truth includes knowing that you don't know all of it. It includes the knowing that the truth that you know is the tip of the iceberg, that there's a concealed behind the unconcealed, that they're twinned, that the truths you know are projections into your experience of a larger unknown, right? And the fact that truth is like that is what he's referring to here with this word intimations. Is that clear? And this is also getting at Pete's question about why is the unconcealed so important here? It's because the truth is never unveiled entire in front of you. That's not what truth is like. And that's hinted at in the fact that truth is an unconcealment. There's more concealed. Right? There's a background mystery in which Dasein is situated.
Right, and so and it's not just let's say things are concealed, they're in a box, and you can only take out one thing at a time. You can't see everything that's in the box all at once. But the concealing is also a withdrawal. It's not just there's some unknowns you don't know right now. The concealing is actually a movement of withdrawal.
Yes, there are things which would be true if you knew them, that are moving away from you, and you're not going to know while they're withdrawn. Right? Well,
it's not things.
Fair. It's not that it's things. Things is not what it is. What it is possible truths that would become truths if they were known. Something like that. What they really are, and he'll use this word later in a technical sense, is untruths. Not in the sense of errors, but in the sense of not having arisen and appeared. And later, when he tries to use untruth in a technical way, that's what he'll use it for. And that causes people from other traditions no end of confusion, because they think that he means something which is an error in the sense of a falsehood, or something that he think of as a non-correspondence, not what he's talking about. Untruth is unexperienced, unrevealed, could be, but isn't at the moment true.
Hidden.
Yes, and it may be hidden in the mode of withdrawal. And the point here is that truth has this accent of appearing to, which is there in aletheia, but it's not simply appearing to. It's the twins of the concealed and unconcealed. I want to talk about confusion for a second, and this this twinning business, because we've seen this twinning business a couple times before, and people need to understand that there is a basic trope of logic all the way back to the Greeks about all distinctions. That you find this in Heraclitus, especially. You find it again in Plato, especially in places like the Sophists. But okay, if you're going to make a distinction, you're going to see a difference between some A and some B. But if those A and those B's have that difference, it's because there's some underlying unstated C that they have in common that allows the distinction to distinguish them. So this is, if someone's taking a course on dialectics, they would also hear this point, right? So in every distinction, two things distinguish: an axis of distinction that makes them different, an underlying sameness that means you're not just talking about how triangles are not blue, but you're talking about how blue is not orange, because they agree on the dimension of color, even if they disagree in the particularity of the color, right? Okay, so this can lead people to focus on only the difference without the similarity, right? Or get confused and think the similarity overrides the difference. It means the difference isn't there. Or they can think of that whole set of all of those three of them as being everything, when it's only defined by one distinction, as one cut, which defines both the direction of the cut and the direction of the similarity, which is orthogonal to the cut. Whenever those kinds of mistakes happen, it's called confusion. You're melding together. You're not seeing if I can put it this way, the necessary twistedness of all logical distinction, or the necessary complexity of the structure of all possible distinction. And if you don't see the full complexity of the structure of every possible distinction, you will fall into confusion. This is the claim. And when he talks about the strife between earth and world can be in strife because they have a dimension of commonality as well as of distinction of exactly this kind. When he talks about the fissure as the falling apart of a unity along these lines, he's talking about exactly this sort of structure emerging or being distinguished. And when he talks here about the playing field of confusion and intimations, he's talking about the fact that these obscurings by only seeing part, right, that he calls confusions, right, as well as the intimations of things not quite seen, but sensed, right? The playing field of all those things is where this free domain of clearing of self-concealing happens, right? So examples like the being of the beings being obscured by the beings themselves being in the foreground, so that's all you notice. That's exactly such a confusion, right? So this confusion term here is a generalization from that those particular examples he might have focused more on being in time as single such confusions. He's now puffed it out to confusion as such is part of the playing field of this. The other word he will always use for this is strife. This goes back to Hesiod, understanding strife as wherever this distinction is happening, there is that structure of the axis of the strife and the commonality of the things striving, right? Okay, so I'm trying to flesh out what he's doing in that that last paragraph. Okay. The point is that this open is not simply a well-lighted place in which all the distinctions of a mechanism are clearly visible, right? he's putting into this open. We heard at the beginning that truth is something like the opening. Right, back, I'm going to turn back a page for a second. Truth here means the clearing of being as openness of the amidst of beings. Right, that was the very first sentence inside of an if clause of third paragraph. So that's the clearing he's talking about. And but this open does not have the character of a box full of light in which all distinctions are clear. It has creating boldness, it is free, it is unprotectedness, it has a there that is appropriated, and it has this playing field of confusion and intimations, right? So all of that is part of this open. Questions about the structure he is sketching here?
The openness be considered as the da. Is the openness the da?
The da is the there, which means it's not just the aspect of openness, but is also the aspect. Da includes a little bit more than the openness. Yes, it includes the openness, but it's the extra thing which the da tells you is that there's a thrown here and nowness to it. It's not just open everywhere to infinity. It's this open here. So da has the extra accent of uniqueness. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Great, Dan?
Yeah, there is this business of steadfastness and the kind of the existential aspect of truth that is not just, as you put it, it's not there for grabbing. We need to be steadfast there and kind of insist, and eventually it'll show, like will show up to us, but it's not obvious at the beginning or something
So I
like
agree
that.
with you. I agree with you. Steadfastness is essential here, and I would even point out that steadfastness here performs a lot of the work that in Plato is performed by generality or outside of timedness. And here we don't have those things. We have steadfastness instead. But the steadfastness he was referring to back in 257 was steadfastness of enduring the truth. And he's relating this to this being there versus being away business. So the steadfastness is being continually open to, and therefore enduring, experiencing, authentically being in the thrownness or the there, right? Including all the captivating of being assigned something by being that grabs your mind, including all the transporting into a future that is rushing and all of that. Experiencing that authentically continually is steadfastness in enduring truth. And the contrast to steadfastly enduring truth is the next TikTok video to distract yourself, right? Where it doesn't have to be truth. It can be a flickering image on a screen that is a shadow cast by an artifact made by another human being. In other words, you're in Plato's cave, right? So the steadfast enduring truth is a eyes open to truth as actuality that is yours, as opposed to the various modes of being away, right? Yes. Okay. So we're now ready to embark upon the history. We've gotten a sketch of how complicated the structure is of this open he's trying to talk about, and we understand that he's trying to talk about a practical transformation, and we're talking about existential information about where we are and where we're going. We're not just talking about history of concepts, but we're also going to talk about history of concepts. So I want to go to this now 261, right? From aletheia to Dasein. And this is helpful because it is a capsule version of the history that we're going to get over the next several sections. But the important thing to understand here is aletheia stands in for the truth of the first beginning. Truth has been experienced in the entire history of metaphysics from the Greeks to Nietzsche. And that includes all the developments that include its deterioration. So aletheia can mean narrowly what it was originally, the original experience of aletheia, but it can also mean the entire history of truth as understood on the background or projection of aletheia versus truth as understood on the projection of Dasein. He's setting himself off from what came before. We're talking about this transition to another beginning, and we're talking about grounding all that in Dasein. So from aletheia to Dasein, we're going from Greek and metaphysics-based philosophy to Heidegger's own, right? It says the critical regress from correctness to openness. And he calls this a regress. He means it's a return. He means there was an element of openness there in original aletheia, but that aletheia has deteriorated into correctness. And it is critical to turn that back, to go back to openness. Dasein is going to undo an emphasis on correctness in the later stages of the aletheia story and go back to the openness sense. The openness sense was there in aletheia, but it was covered over. And Dasein is going to bring it back out. So this is the most essential original thing about truth is its openness character, its actuality character, not its correctness character, not its agreement character. It's not a correspondence between two things. It is a that there is openness at all, right? Is that distinction first clear to people? Okay. Could argue how much openness there already was in aletheia, but this is the very next line. Openness, first the essential extent of aletheia, and later still undetermined in that respect. What does he mean by the latter? He means the essential extent of aletheia. How big was aletheia? What was aletheia meant to cover? Was it only meant to cover beings, or the being of beings? Was only their truth that was being talked about? No. Aletheia already had this notion of the openness of things, the light in physis. Physis is the Greek word for nature, but is also arising, appearing, and its root word phu is the same as their word for light, basically. It's the shining appearing. Openness, first the essential element, essential extent of aletheia. This essential extent itself determines the place, time, space of openness, the cleared amidst of beings. So this is again his own view. There is the cleared is not beings, it's in a midst of beings. It's the fact that we are, it's the truth into which we're thrown, not even the world in which we're thrown. The truth in which we're thrown is a cleared amidst of beings. Cleared, we talked about amidst. You are a being, but you're a being surrounded by other beings in a cleared amidst, in a truth. Thereby truth definitely detached from all beings, no matter how they are interpreted, whether as physis, idea, or perceptium, object, the known, that which is thought. In other words, you're not going to come up with a theory in which truth is one of the beings over there in a box, right? Truth is never going to be one of the beings because it is something about the open realm or domain in which beings appear in the first place, right? So structurally, you cannot have a theory of truth that makes it a being. Okay. Truth, now even more the question of its own essential occurrence. In other words, now that we know that it's not a being, how does truth occur? It occurs as something like this open realm transpiring. It has to be out of its own essence, that in turn out of being. The original essence, however, is the clearing of self-concealing. The truth is the original truth of being, the event. This clearing essentially occurs and is in the attuned creative undergoing. Truth is as grounding the there and as Dasein. Dasein, the ground of the human being, thereby asks to know who's the human being. So the point is the answer to the question of what truth is it's this original clearing, and that original clearing is undergone in attuned, authentic Dasein, something like that. Dasein is the ground of the human being. It is the mission of the human being to be the there or place or site in which this kind of truth transpires, occurs, is undergone. And that means the thing which is actually at stake here is not that he doesn't think he knows what the essence of truth is. He just told you. The question is, who are we? Right? He's put forth a standard of what truth is and what something like being of service to truth actually occurring might be, is being sketched in that. And that is in the form of a challenge. The challenge is, what use are you to the truth? That's the challenge. Okay. Isabel.
Yes, but he can't. Oh, I'm sorry. He can't say, Jason. He can't say what is truth, what truth is. You can, but not he. that's why he says the essence of truth, because the minute you say what truth is this, truth is that, you've already identified truth, and therefore it is and it cannot occur.
I did not identify it, but I agree with you. I used the word is. Fair. That, well, partly fair. He is going to say that this sort of truth essentially occurs, but the punchline at the end of this of what is the human being does not turn on that distinction. The question is, what use are human beings to truth, to the essential occurrence of truth, the essential occurrence of being as this, right? That's the point of this from Aletheia to Dasein. So again, this is a sketch of the history, but it's not the history as what went wrong, or where was a wrong turn made, or where was something incorrect, or where can something be corrected. It's a history from the standpoint of a what is at stake. What is up for a future decision that would change futures, if that makes sense. Again, there's this going back to the practical and this and the projection and the possibilities of being for Dasein frame that is carried over entire from being in time. Okay. We still have to ask ourselves, that's clear, that's what he's wanting to do. And the next section will give us even more detail on what that's going to mean and entail. And so will the end of the end of section 7. But we also have to ask ourselves, is his understanding of this history correct? We'll get there. I want to jump ahead to the last paragraph on the main section on 262, end of 207. Leave aside the things about faculties, etc. It says Dasein grounds itself and essentially occurs in the attuned creative undergoing, and thus first becomes the ground of and that which grounds the human being, and the human being is now newly confronted with the question of who, a question which interrogates human being more originally as steward of the stillness of the passing by of the last God. So he's already sketching what would be to him an adequate answer to that who question at the end, right? Steward of the stillness for the passing by of the last God. The last God will be discussion in section 7 when we get there. But we have to ask why that would be anything like what the mission of truth would be on the grounds of Dasein. Okay, I'm not going to try to explain all of that because we'll have a whole separate section in 7 about that. But the point that I'm making here is this is not a. He did say this was a thinking exposedly venturing way out on a limb, and he's showing that in spades. He's going all the way to the end of the limb, and he's going to tell you what truth is, what it means about where we are, what it means about what we should do, and what it means about the human mission is, right? Don't fault him for lack of boldness. Okay. Are there any questions about that sketch before we get to the things where he tries to explain the history of any of this, because that's where we're headed? There are no questions. Whenever I get no questions, I do not know if this is going over everyone's heads, or they don't buy it, or it was obvious to them on first reading, and anywhere in between.
All of the above.
All of the above. Okay. All right, then let's turn to Plato in 236. Okay, so Zygon. Did people understand what he was talking about when he said Zygon? If you've read the Essence of Truth book with us, you might have a little bit of background on this. Otherwise, Zygon is yoke. Why is he talking about Plato and yoke here? What is the yoke being talked about? And what is it yoking? Pete or Dan?
Yeah, so it's when you have truth as correspondence, there's a yoking of the fact with the idea, or the correspondence itself is the yoke, right?
So we're not yet at correspondence, actually, when we're in Plato, as opposed to in Aristotle yet. Plato is talking about the yoke as the between, and he also talks about it as the light, and he talks about it as the truth. Plato calls light the yoke, and he's thinking of perceiver and perceived, yes, but the light is the between, that is the yoke between perceiver and perceived that lets perception happen. Heidegger is here claiming that that is the move that enables the switch to truth as correspondence later, but he's not claiming that it is that switch. It is first just something noticed about perception, that perception relies upon a between. And in the case of physical seeing perception, that between is a something that yokes together perceiver and perceived. And Plato does not present that as a abstract correspondence. He says it's light. It is a third thing between the perceiver and the perceived that yokes them together. It is not just a perceiver-perceived dyad, but it is a third between. And it is talked about exactly as this metaxy, this between, that joins them. There's no question that for Plato, this is part of his exposition of the notion of idea. But he's doing this precisely because for Plato, the idea is not in the perceiver. Aristotle is the person who shoves the idea into the mind of the perceiver because otherwise he does not know where it is. He's willing to have there be a form of the object and an idea in the mind of the perceiver, and he's willing to put the two into correspondence because those are two things, each of which he can locate and therefore understand. But to Aristotle, the notion of an idea that is in neither of those two places doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because he cannot imagine, and I mean that literally, image, where it is. And if he doesn't know where it is, he doesn't think that it can be. But Plato told him where it is. He says it's between.
Okay. What page are we on?
We're on page 263, right? Aletheia itself is forced from the yoke, and as luminosity concerns the unconcealedness as being as such, and the pathway for perception. Thus it concerns only the domain of the respective facing sides of beings and the soul. I commit to you that latter part is only in Aristotle, not simply in Plato. Indeed, Aletheia first determines this domain as such, though assuredly without allowing its own being and ground to come into question. The point is, there is a prior understanding of something like the open as the between, and it's already there in Plato, and that is exactly what Heidegger needs to go over and explain how the open and between that we had in Plato is or is not the open he is discussing. Dan, question or comment?
Yeah, is this kind of the yoke, the first transition between aletheia and ideas in Plato? Something like it's kind of the first decay of aletheia, and it's something like Plato struggle what to do with it and eventually settled with ideas as a solution to the yoke or transition?
Heidegger is sketching this as a way in which aletheia as unconcealment, which should have contained with it the phenomenal information of the experience of openness, deteriorated into a conceptual machinery for representation of how the projector might work that eventually decayed into truth as correspondence. So yes, he is presenting this as where that slope starts, but the way in which Plato talks about it is not that this is prior, that this notion of yoke and between is prior to the ideas. It's the same as the ideas. The ideas theory, if I can put it that way, is built upon the yoke between and the understanding of that between on the analogy of light. And by the way, light is the physical analogy of this. It has a more proper term in the noumenal realm. And for Plato in the noumenal realm, it's not light anymore. It's good. A good that is beyond being and older than being in truth. He says age and dignity and power, right? So the good beyond being that corresponds in the realm of the ideas to the sun in the visible world is the origin of the light in which ideas come to be, and are intelligible, something like that.
Is this also the movement where the aletheia kind of fall into visible, into like images and light, and it moves from something that is not necessarily related with light into something that is now associated with light and with appearances and stuff like that? And
it's definitely moving into appearances, but we can talk about whether or not that's a falling. Heidegger does present it as being so, but the physis, the light word is there in physis. And this is the part that you never see in Heidegger, but aletheia is not one privative, it's two. Aletheia is alethe. Lethe is oblivion. But the 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 at the end of lethe is seeing. Lethe is the unseen. Aletheia is the not unseen. It's a double negative. The core word in the Greek original experience is to see. And Heidegger never brings that out. The closest he gets is later he'll talk about the semblance as theater. We know how critical theater was to the Greeks, but we'll get to how he talks about that. So yes, there's going to be a different understanding of semblance here in Plato and in Heidegger. Heidegger thinks that when concealment is lost sight of, something essential is lost about this strife-like, oppositional, conceptual, logical, tangle, dialectical, if you want to put it that way, nature of these truths. And he does see in Plato and the move towards this yoke of light is both a moving to a visible light metaphysics, so to speak. It's something like an attempt to understand it with an image or a physical analogy to an image, or even a physical theory behind that. But a lot of the deterioration of that into agreement, into the truthless correspondence, isn't yet there in Plato, precisely because Plato does believe in ideas, and people like Aristotle after him who don't are the ones who think of the idea as only a pattern in the mind that has to correspond to the form as the pattern in the thing, right? Whereas for Plato, the idea is precisely in the between, right? It's not meant to be in the mind. Okay.
One more thing, is this also like, because here the title is from aletheia to Dasein, is also like moving away from light, also like Dasein, there is event Dasein, there is no more light anymore in even in double negation or whatever.
Yeah, he says that when aletheia becomes phus light, and that is under certain luminosity, the character of the alpha privative is lost. He says the concealedness is lost. Now, here's my question to you. Can you say that Plato, the author of the Allegory of the Cave, had no experience of the character of concealedness in the essence of truth? I deny it, right? You can say that for anyone for whom the Allegory of the Cave wasn't the existential situation of the man attempting to know, that falling away might happen. But when Heidegger himself is describing the Allegory of the Cave, he has no such claim against it, right? So Plato is fully phenomenally aware of the role of concealedness and even of mystery in the essence of truth. But he thinks that if you get outside into the above ground under the light of noonday of the idea of the good, you can see things as they are, something like that. Okay. But everyday man is in the concealment of the semblance of the looking at flickering shadows cast by artifacts made by other men who did not know the truth, right? Which is also a metaphor for language. right? So my point is that Plato has a notion of the open, Plato has a notion of the between, Plato has a notion of concealment. They're not Heidegger's notions of them. Heidegger is not agreeing with Plato here, right? But the substance of the disagreement between them is not that Plato didn't have his own versions of those things. It's that Heidegger doesn't think that they're adequate, or they don't agree with his own, right? It's not true that Plato had a simple correspondence theory of truth, missed the idea of concealment in truth, missed the idea of the between, missed the idea of the open. He didn't miss any of those things. He had a very different take on how all those things are put together than Heidegger has, right? But it wasn't because he fits into the box of this caricature of he just had a correspondence theory of truth because he was misled by his light metaphysics. Okay. There is at least as much light metaphysics in the idea of the open and the horizon as there is in Plato's theory of the ideas, right? You can't get away from that because it is phenomenal for human thinking. Okay.
Yeah, so just something to add there. I don't know if I brought this up when we were doing the Theaetetus lecture, but in around 65, Heidegger says that his earlier view that Plato had invented the correspondence theory was no longer tenable based on what he had learned by the mid-60s.
That's great. I mean, I think that's entirely right. I mean, that correspondence theory is definitely there in later thinkers. I think the seeds of it are definitely there in Aristotle. I can see with all the criticisms of it that Heidegger has full blown in the time of someone like Philo of Alexandria, for example. So it's not some later modern invention, but I don't think Plato is the originator of it. So it's interesting to know that he came to the same conclusion later. Okay. All right. So in History of the Essence of Truth, he gives this capsule history of how Aletheia supposedly gets lost, the crisis in Plato and Aristotle. I want to jump ahead to truth is certainty for a second, because I think we've talked about those points about the Greeks reasonably well. I would put it this way. Plato had an understanding of those issues, which is firmly rooted in the Greek understanding before him, in Greek language, including the word aletheia, in Greek mythology, in previous Greek philosophical thinking. That doesn't mean that it was right, but yeah. Okay. He didn't miss things that only Heraclitus saw or something like that, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, but now let's jump ahead to the moderns for a second, because this is where on page 266, truth is certainty. And I'm going to make sure that this part of the history is now clear, right? So the critical things here is he says, this representation that I represent is certainty, the knowledge that is known to itself as such. Thereby, however, ratio itself degrades itself below itself, descends below its own niveau, which in the beginning consisted indeed in the immediate perception of beingness as a whole. The claim here is that the move to the I represent is the code word for that in his own language is certainty, the knowledge that is known to itself as such, and that the move to certainty degrades reason below itself. Why is he saying this? Who is he saying it about?
Descartes.
Yes, he's saying about Descartes. What is the move that Descartes makes when he's trying to get to certainty? He claims, and why is he doing it? Because it's important to see a little bit of why Descartes is doing this. Descartes thinks that the origin of error, and he says this explicitly in the Meditations, that the origin of error is the mind coming to conclusions for which it has no justification before it has sufficient justification. It is the mind sticking its neck out too far and being overly ambitious about what it knows. If the mind stuck to only what it knew for sure, there wouldn't be a problem. But the mind overly ambitiously assumes that the appearances of things to itself are the way the things actually are. And the way in which it can cure itself of this is to skeptically say of each of these things, only it seems to me that, I judge that, I see this. When the consciousness testifies only to its experiences as experiences, the appearances to itself as appearances to itself, and does not stick its neck out to extending from those it seems to me's to, and therefore it actually is, Descartes thinks therefore it immunizes itself against error, and it reposes on a ground where it can be certain. The mind can know itself, can know its own experiences, and will not mislead itself there. But if it tries to ascribe its own judgments of its experiences to the external realities to which they are trying to refer, then it can overstep what it actually knows and commit error. That is what Descartes thinks is the origin of error. It is excessive, arrogant ambition on the part of the mind, taking the it seems to me's and turning them into therefore they are's. Okay. Heidegger calls exactly that move reason degrading itself below itself. Why?
Isn't this kind of a psychological move? Like to treat something as true or false only if you are certain of it, or something like along these lines. It's you kind of step outside in a way, the outside reason, because you go with psychology. I guess I will take it that way in a little bit.
Okay, I have another response, but I'll give Isabel a chance first. Isabel.
Yes, my response is because certainty eliminates the question.
That's partly true, partly definitely true. Certainty is trying to not live exposedly. It's trying to repose on a ground that is safe. It is, you're limiting the claims to be on surer ground, but the result is you're not taking the risks that you may need to take. But for Heidegger, there's an even more basic that is related to the questioning part, which is it's going off mission. Heidegger has just told us that Dasein's existential purpose is to be the place or site where the truth of being is revealed. And if you're not going to be the place or site where the truth of being is revealed, you're falling below your possible high purpose. You are degrading what your mind could be and do below itself. You stop trying to know what is actually true, and you're just trying to establish an opinion that you think will pass for correct without challenge by your confreres, right? You're retreating from criticism, pulling in your horns, and from Heidegger's point of view, because you have stopped being dedicated to actually arriving at truth.
In other words,
Certainty
you
is the enemy
stop.
of truth. Go ahead.
In other words, you stop being Dasein.
In a sense, it is a you stop being authentically exposedly Dasein. Yes, you still have some of the character, but yes, the mission of Dasein that he sketched, you are giving up. But he calls this even a degrading of reason below itself, right? He says, which in the beginning consisted indeed in the immediate perception of beingness as a whole. So he's not even claiming that what Descartes was turning away from was a full awareness of the mission to understand actuality as a transpiring once. It was, in fact, the attempt to understand beingness as a whole, and beingness as a whole is already it's the answer to the guiding question, not the founding question. It was trying to ask, what are the beings? It was trying to ask the being, what is the the thing which all the beings share? That's what reason had as its mission. But in Descartes, it turns away even from that mission. It's not trying to even tell me about the being of the beings. It's trying to tell me about the seemings to me of the seemings to me, right? Jason?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is exactly what we're talking about right now, but there's a different view of Althea, that it can be either disclosing truth, or it could be not forgetting. And I'm not sure if Heidegger is distinguishing that at this point in 1936.
He is. I mean, he's already done most of his expositions on aletheia at this point. But the lethe, of which is the privative, means oblivion, forgotten, and concealed together. So a lethe can mean not forgotten, it can mean the not forgotten, as well as the not unseen, as well as the discovered. But the critical accent that Heidegger is putting on it here is the, if I go to this way, the experiencing aspect. It's not what the thing is that is revealed, whether it's a truth or remembering, right? It is the unconcealed, open, experienced, if I go to it that way, which is there in memory, thoughtful memory, he'll say in the later what is called thinking book I'm thinking of, where memory will come more to the fore, so to speak. But the site of both memory and we would say perception itself, not judgment, not judging something true as opposed to untrue, but the experience itself is the accent of aletheia he's trying to get at here. Does that help?
Yes, but I always think that he's also referring to something that Plato refers to, that we know everything, but then we're born forgetting. And I don't know if Heidegger is, does he deal with that?
He's not primarily commenting on. You're talking about the theory of anamnesis or recollection in Plato, as discussed in like dialogues like the Meno. I don't think he's directly talking about a Plato's recollection here at all. I think that the aletheia being discussed here is this unconcealedness, arising appearing of truth as immediately perceived, not as correspondence. Those are the accents here. There are later things which Heidegger does with memory, but not particularly with the Platonic anamnesis. From his point of view, I would say that the doctrine of recollection is a mythical attempt to explain the role of memory in something like noetic perception, if I put it that way. But it's going to take us a bit of field to go after that. Dan.
Yeah, going back to your discussion of Descartes, and I think at the same time that Descartes like is dropping most of the thing as uncertain, he proposes the mathematical certainty. He introduced this mathematical certainty and pretty much kind of loses touch with experience in a way. Like everything, we are certain only of things that can be projected in this mathematical or fit in this mathematical projection. And it's kind of like, it's a double move, like dropping most of the things and proposing something and as a solution to this.
So partly true, although some of that is honestly successors of Descartes rather than Descartes himself. Descartes has his own more ambitious moves. He definitely does the certainty move that Heidegger is talking about, but the Descartes of the Meditations is also going to be singularly confident that he knows from the idea of God that he has that God has to exist and cannot be a deceiver, and these other sorts of heroic metaphysical conclusions that the later mathematizing, more skeptical Cartesians would not necessarily follow him on. And my point is that some of that is his followers rather than the man himself. But certainly that is the direction or tendency he was going in. I would also say that Descartes is a mathematical thinker in the sense that he platonizes and imagizes and geometrizes. He thinks of truth and truth relations as being, this way, space-like vectorized. There's truth in this aspect or that as this dimension of distinction or that. And he does have a full-blown correspondence theory of truth where the truth judgments are the ones that correspond to the way those things actually are in the mind of God, something like that. And you also see that even more so in someone like Spinoza, who will, have the two modes of thought and substance. Oh, sorry, two modes of substance, right? But the thought and extension, and try to show the correspondence between them, so that that mathematizing attitude is taken even further in the post-Cartesians of his school than it was in him himself. But I think that it is fair to say that this move of trying to rest on certainty by not trying to have judgments that reach exposedly or to reality was a move that I mean, you can't even say that Descartes originated, because many of the particular anti-skeptical moves he made were ones which were already there in Augustine. But this particular move to pull in the horns about your judgment to what you can be sure of, and that is the interior testimony. You can always relate your interior testimony honestly, and there you will not go wrong. That attitude of Descartes is most definitely a pulling in the horns of, if I come to this way, how ambitious intellectual intuition is about trying to actually reach reality or reach actuality.
Is this also like the categories that started with Aristotle is part of this movement?
I'm in the categories, but even also at the principle of non-contradiction in the metaphysics, right, is an attempt to arrive at something that's that is, you know, so certain that it will not be disturbed by later thinkers. There's lots of people with logical thinking bent that have had this attitude, but Descartes is blatant about it in that he says this is the cause of all error, when people exceed what they know in their judgments of things and stick their neck out. And like a pauper reading that would be horrified. It's like the cause of all error is, you know, attempting to make contact with reality with a claim that can be falsified. It's almost like Descartes is objecting to your hypotheses being heroic enough that they could reach a reality or reach an actuality. So my point is that the criticism here of that reason degrades itself below itself when it tries to rest on certainty, that is very similar to the kind of criticism that Popper had of the logical positivists of his era, right? Okay, and this is the same era basically. Okay, but from Heidegger's point of view, the reason that the move to certainty is a going off task is, yes, it's a subjectification, yes, it's a psychologization, but fundamentally it is abandoning the mission to know truth as actual truth, right? As truth of external reality and actuality, as truth of being. He says that being itself now becomes graspable, customary, and free from any strangeness. Why does that happen? That happens because proceeding on that basis, Descartes will, arrive at the judgment that what we mean by being is that something has a thinkable attribute. And this will later lead us to 1960s era theories that to be is to be the possible value of an existential quantifier, right? In other words, values of variables and intelligibility is governing what gets to count as existing, something like that. And this is an attempt to make sure that whatever being actually is intelligible on a plane of certainty, something like that. But this is from Heidegger's point of view, a dramatic pulling in of the horns of the claim of the claims to know. Okay. Okay.
If I can say something more, like
please.
This away from strangeness, it seems like Heidegger always said that the Greeks understood being and truth and so on in relation to their production, which is something they were very familiar with. So they stay within that production and whatever was already there, and they were in charge of it. And then kind of like they keep all the philosophical concepts within that, I don't know, familiar domain, and they didn't want to risk anything. Or
so I know that he does say that at times, and the claim that the productive comportment is the basis of the understanding of or horizon for being in Plato is certainly one he makes with his critique of the idea of the bed or something like that. But I'm not sure how much it actually applies to the Greeks or Greek philosophers as such. If there's one distinction that the Greeks are most famous for, it's the distinction between nature and convention, right? And art is all about convention. Art is all about what is not made by nature. And the Greeks' attitude towards what was made by nature versus what was made by convention was very clear. What is made by nature is more excellent, more fine, and in every way the model for what is made by art, right? Nature was the standard. Nature was the place where truth was touched, and it was understood as very much not convention. They weren't primarily interested in what I'm trying to say is that Heidegger's distinction there between the productive comportment and something like a theoretical comportment is a much later Cartesian sort of frame. And what they were actually thinking of is natural versus conventional. So I don't know that it actually tracks in these things, but the idea of the bed is the closest that he gets to finding a slam dunk on something like that. But ideas of beds versus ideas of more natural things are problematic to begin with. Sorry, Jason, question?
I always understood Descartes as not trying to be an existentialist, but when you look at his Latin, he's actually arguing, I think, therefore I'm a thinking being. And he's not trying to complete an issue about how things exist. How tenable is that? I mean, it seems like they're asking too much from Descartes.
I don't think that's germane. I mean, yes, he was not trying to be an existentialist. The actual famous, I think, therefore I am argument that Descartes is pigeonholed with was actually taken over whole cloth from Augustine, and Descartes, that's not what Descartes was original about. But the move to certainty that Heidegger is describing here is, at least in that verbatim form, definitely actual original Descartes. And this is not part of the I think therefore I am argument. It's much later, where he's trying to discuss the causes of error later in the meditations. It's like 3 or 4 meditations later. But what's the claim? There's a commonality of the two in that Descartes does think that the mind can know itself. The move to certainty is a move to know what appearances appear to the mind. It's almost a pre-phenomenological move. You see also this in Husserl's book, The Cartesian Meditations. There's a commonality there with the phenomenological epoche kind of move. But it is very much a immunizing an observation against possible error by not claiming that it is true of the things outside the mind, but only as true of what the mind experiences itself. Does that help?
Yeah, but I find it interesting that Descartes and Husserl were trying to deal with an era with politics that was so divisive. They were looking for some kind of unity. I'm not saying that they're correct. I'm just saying they were really driving.
The number of errors that don't have that quality in which their philosopher is active is quite small. Possibly because it's par for the political course, but I mean, there certainly was plenty of divisiveness in Plato's day. See above, Death of Socrates, and so Plato writes lots of political works as a result. I don't disagree with the point, but I just don't think it decides much on these philosophical questions. It's pretty much always the case. If you're a philosopher and you live in a time when there isn't such political turmoil, you can count yourself very lucky, exceptionally lucky. I want to get back to the rest of the Truth is Certainty chapter, because the early part was about Descartes, but the second page of it basically is about this stuff going over into the German idealists. But there's one passing point here about Descartes, which is worth mentioning. He says, what does it signify that Descartes still attempts to justify certainty itself as lumum naturale on the basis of the highest one beings as creatum creatoris? Right? He doesn't answer this question. But the point that he's making there is he's tying back the Cartesian position to a Platonic version of natural light, almost light metaphysics, along with the created creator, to something like if not a Christian, at least a biblically informed metaphysics, like the kind you get from Philo Alexandria, etc. I think it's an open question there how much that's the concern with certainty is based upon those things. But for Heidegger, it is evidence that he's on the right track and seeing where the earlier moves prepared the Cartesian position. I think Cartesian position is innovative in the sense that it's doing something new that the previous positions did not. Okay. He says, in Kant, you get the doctrine of the postulates and German idealism as the absoluteness of the ego in consciousness. By the way, the absoluteness of the ego is an attempt to overcome the subjectivism of Descartes by making the subject into everything. If the subject follows the whole, then the whole thus constituted is no longer just the subject, something like that. I'm thinking of people like Fichte and Hegel. But from Heidegger's point of view, that's just extending Cartesian certainty to the limits of the horizon, and it's deciding to live perpetually in the cave and never go outside. Right, from Heidegger's point of view, it's this same retreat to certainty on steroids, now extended to the a historical version of whatever humanity has thought of the history of the spirit or something like that. But that is just it's renouncing the ability to get outside the put it this way, artificial constructions of the subjective pole. So that's why Heidegger sees this as part of the same continuing error. He calls this the deepest entanglement in the forgottenness of being, and that in the era after this, it sinks into mere technique characteristic of theory of science. Appeals not without justification to Plato. And then he talks about, he tries to extend this to neo-Kantianism, life and existence, Dilthey, Jaspers, etc. And he basically claims that the modern critics of all this that are somewhat derivative from Nietzsche, or some you often thought of as adjacent to Heidegger in terms of existentialism, are still in this, if not directly in this camp. They do not understand what has happened in Western metaphysics and what prepare itself as necessity for the other beginning. The point that he's making there is that the life philosophy turn, the Nietzschean seeing something more substantial belief than the ego or representation beneath the subjective pole, something like that, that it's going to be called life, and it's going to be turned into, theory of the drives and all that sort of stuff, which you might think of as an attempt to get something more being like an objective like underneath at least the subject pole of the Cartesian position. From Heidegger's point of view, it's the same. It's going to be result in the same being closed off from truth, because you're instead of seeing there as being something in the human being which is immediately called upon to live into or step into truth, it's finding all the ways in which the benighted, bewildered ape you were discussing is not even capable of Cartesian representation, right? Not to put too fine a point on it, right? So from Heidegger's point, this is firing pan fire territory. You're not going to get back to a mission to know the truth of being from a life philosophy evolutionary critique of Cartesian rationalism, if I can put it that way. Okay, so I'm just trying to summarize this capsule history that he gives before the question of what truth is about. Okay. I now want to give a little bit of assessment here, right? I think that when it comes to understanding the process whereby truth became correctness, and correctness became certainty, and certainty became the subjective move to have the subjects follow the whole, or the life philosophy evolutionary critique of that rationalism, on all that, I could put it this way, late ancient to modern, even contemporary Nietzschean ground, I think Heidegger's historical critique is sound, right? He may not be right about all those things. There may be quibbles you can make for how much Hegel's moves tends to work here or something, but he's not misrepresenting these people or their role in the history of that thought, right? That thought does begin with something like an attempt to have rational access to the truths of being, and it does issue in a Nietzschean endpoint where truth is a kind of error without beings like us cannot live, right? Where it's purely pragmatic, purely for the power purposes of the drives of the human animal, something like that. And that is definitely the direction or tendency of what he's calling what is accomplished in the whole history of Western metaphysics. Compared to Heidegger, I'm inclined to put more of the, if we can put it this way, more of the onus for that development on the later terms in this series rather than the earlier ones. I think that Nietzsche's particular directions of error are his own, and they're not Hegel's, and Hegel's are different from Descartes, etc. But I can agree with him that in each of these eras, there is a move away from anything like a belief that it is both possible and called for human being to be dedicated to truth as something knowable to which he should be open, that it is a duty to withstand, endure, and know, and testify about, something like that. All right, that's just my assessment of that history. The place where I have the most reservations against him is I see all these ways in which he is he ascribes to Plato things which are results of that historical development to come later, and sees the germs of them in Plato, rather than doing full justice to the complexity of Plato's thought and its similarity to much of his own, honestly. I think he's more just to that when he's discussing it in the Essence of Truth essay, especially the stuff on the allegory of the cave, where he's face to face with it. He's perfectly fair to Plato on those things. We talked about some of those differences. That matters a bit to me because I find some of those understandings of Plato about those things still relatively attractive. But that's me. Anyway, that's my assessments of that history. The assessments of that history, though, should not detract us or not prevent us from noticing Heidegger has his own position that he is positively claiming for his own reasons, having to do with his own phenomenological analysis of man's situation, something like that, that are not dependent upon his critique of Plato being correct or his understanding of this history being correct, right? His own vision, if I can put it that way, for what is positively called for or asked of a philosophical thinker are his own, and they should be, met, understood, and assessed on their own terms, not as a pedant's history quarrel, right? There's plenty of history that he's trying to explain, how we got here or why we are in the place that we are, but his positive vision is its own. All right, thank you, Darlene. I hope it was useful to you. We put up later, so we put up videos of the discussion, including the continuation of the discussion, on YouTube later, so you can check out the channel for that if you want this one and past ones. Thanks for listening. Okay. All right, I want to jump ahead to another critical thing. I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of the later pieces of this. We definitely want to get to the Nietzsche stuff toward the end before we're done. But there's another critical issue I wanted to point out here. This is related to why I brought up all the Dasein things beforehand and pointed that this is an attempt at a practical dislodgement, something like that. This is on page 274, section 222, just truth. When a philosopher like Heidegger, in a book written for himself, gives you a paragraph on truth, you should probably read it. He says, only if we are standing in the clearing do we experience the self-concealing. Okay. What is the point of this statement? I would say this is a claim that this is something which has to be, I put it this way, ventured, right? Not just read. Right? This is something where he's appealing to you to go have the experience yourself, right? Not to read about it in books, right? So, and this was also related to Pete's thing of, why is the concealing so important here, right? If we're standing in the clearing, we experience the self-concealing. So that truth is never a propositionally integrated system to which appeal could be made, as it is in much of the modern logical positivists or in even the Hegelian rationalists, if that makes sense. Truth is the ground as one that retains and penetrates and that protrudes above the concealed without annulling it, the attuning disposition that disposes as this ground, for this ground is the event itself as the essential occurrence of being. The event bears truth equals truth protrudes through the event. Okay. How incomprehensible is this to Joe? I want to know. If Joe is awake. He might not be. I think that this gets, Pete, at your question about why the concealed matters, right? He's saying that the truth protrudes through the event. Truth protrudes through the through the open, right? You never experience truth as a known entirety, right? It always has limits, boundaries. It is always an out of an unknown, right? So, but the claim is that you know this, you experience self-concealing by standing in the clearing, right? Not by reading about the clearing in a book. Is the distinction clear? Is what he's claiming here clear? I want Pete to answer this one. Pete is on mute.
Yeah, so he's saying so I'm not why is truth the withdrawal? Why isn't truth just an event in the clearing? Why does being have to withdraw? Why is that?
So it's not a system with a Y in it. It's if you try to stand in the open and apprehend truth and chase after it and question after it, you will discover that in fact it does. He's not claiming that this is a logical deduction from it. He's claiming this is a empirical observation. It is, there is always the mystery. There's always what eludes. If you like, you can put this down, if you want a systematic argument for it, to the finiteness of Dasein, right? But truth has the character of arising, appearing out of what you didn't know before, and you're not going to get to the end before you end, right? There's a wonderful, I don't know if it's wonderful. There's a Socratic precursor to this when he's talking about how much you can know of the heavens, and he's comparing it to the dream of ascending above them. I think this is in the Phaedo at the end of his life, right? And he basically says, you're looking through the bottom of a soup out of a soda straw at an immensity, right? There is a sense of the epicness of truth and the finiteness of human life. You get there even in the Socratics, which I think is the same thing here, right? If you're asking for a propositionally integrated system that you want to be consistent and exhaustive, you might find it a strange logical, quandary about whether or not there will be a hole anywhere. If you're actually standing in the clearing trying to understand the truth, the holes are everywhere. You've got the barest scaffolding between the pieces. I think that the question is not question. I think that the claim behind it is not more than that.
So we're comparing this to Hegel, who says that, we keep doing dialectics, but eventually we'll get to the absolute and the end of history.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel thinks that the changes of all of philosophical thought can be rung through such that at the end of them, you know that you have exhausted the possibilities of spiritual thinking, and that the endpoint at which you have arrived, which will include, to be fair to him, theorems about freedom and theorems about what is left up to the future to decide, but subject to those provisos of what is left open, the whole series can be not only exhausted but seen to be exhausted and known to be exhausted. Heidegger's not having it, right?
And so Heidegger is saying that the withdrawal of being with a Y is because of Dasein's finitude. The withdrawal is that there's always an unknown that Dasein can't.
I may be selling it short because that's only one of the ways. I mean, there's an immediate way of forsakenness by being, or being bereft of being, that is more like the plight of withdrawal, right? The plight of a not known. The plight of a not known, though, is is going to not result in a despair, but in an urgent questioning, something like that. And the urgent questioning is going to have something at stake, right? But it's not simply an argument from finitude. I may be selling it short when I put it that way, although I do think that's involved. It is the forward-directed future at stakeness of the decisions about what the essence of truth is that he is actually appealing to here, right? The essence of truth is at stake, in play, being decided. And that means that it is the farthest thing from a settled question in a system on which you can rely that answers everything.
And so when truth events and you in your historical time have a new truth for the first time, it's still not going to be the final truth.
It's going to be surrounded by intimations of unknowns and mores. It's going to be a particular, known to be particular, known to be limited, partial revelation, something like that.
And so any truth you come upon, there's still, being is still withdrawing as you come upon that truth. Being
can be approaching you in that truth, but it's large and it contains multitudes, and it has others and elsewheres. The way I would put it is just that truth occurs on a background of mystery and a background of errancy. The background of mystery is already there, and the background of errancy means that even some of the things you think are settled and determined are revised later, right?
Right. And so you brought up errancy. So even when you come upon the truth, you might actually be going down the wrong path. You will discover
the truth about how light necessarily yokes together perceiver and perceived, and you will not notice that you are introducing the requirements for a correspondence theory of truth that is going to close off the perception of initial openness, whatever, right? There's 100 ways in which the confusion he describes can arise, in which the emphasize can cover over the other aspects that come along with it. Jason, question?
Yeah, I think a truth is a situation where you're kind of aware of something, but you can't articulate it, and communicate it very well. That's just my understanding of the openness of truth.
I would say that's an intimation, but you can struggle to articulate it, and the sayers or the thinkers are the ones that try to bring it to language. And some of the later Heidegger is trying to talk about that as kind of a calling or mission, so to speak. But Heidegger certainly would agree with you that plenty more than you can articulate. This is why he emphasizes attunement all the time, and he talks about how even mood is a mode of attunement, or is a mode of revelation of being, right? You can know something through a mood before you know it consciously. But so it is certainly true that you have, it goes this way, more senses for sensing truth and being than just conscious ratiocination. You still can try to bring the things that you experience to language. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, fair thought. Okay. All right.
Jason,
Yes, please.
aren't these words very, very similar to what he says about Dasein in the face of the abyss? It's the attuning disposition that with a stance that Dasein takes, and the steadfastness and the silence and the reticence. These are very similar words to me.
Yes, I mean, I would even say that he likes to talk about the withstanding of of the truth, or the withstanding of the the ongoing events, right, or the ongoing nature of the event, something like that. Why is it withstanding? Because it is a questioning, hard, and it is something which of which human being is capable at its heights. We're subject to falling and distraction away from it in lots of ways. It is meant to be a high calling. It is meant to be a hard path. He loves the analogy of the shortest path, meaning the steepest ascent on a mountain slope, right? If you turn directly into the mountain, you're going to have the shortest number of steps to take, but each one is going to be as steep and hard as possible. Is the analogy there? But yes, I mean, I think that I would even say that he has his ethic is a kind of ethic of thought about how one should be in response to these things, in response to this situation. If I wanted to go into the more of the correspondences with Plato, I would say that there's lots of things that he ascribes here as propers and as called fors and as called, that are in Plato simply ascribed to good, right? They're about good. But he doesn't use that term. He doesn't call it that. He's not enamored of that as an idea. But certainly more important than correctness is a proper, and he even says at times necessary, where what he means by necessary is more like called for than has to occur. Okay. There's a couple of other things I wanted to make sure we talk about here. We'll get to it the next time a bit, but there's this notion of we already talked about thrownness. There's the appropriated and the transporting, and we want to have at least a little bit of that here. We'll get more of it next time, but what's the point? The point is that the truth that Dasein is called upon to resolutely endure, sustain, something like that, is one which has these characters of personality, selfhood, ownness, uniqueness, and those have the character of appropriated to these tasks and transported to them as possibilities. I want to know if any of those terms, which some go back to earlier, if I go this way, existential psychology and being in time, are news or incomprehensible to anybody here, right? Do we know what he means by appropriated? Do we know what he means by transporting? Dan, appropriating.
Own something like like it means appropriated by being.
Yes, that there's a sense in which being itself gives the content to Dasein's existence. What does that mean? If we just try to translate it to sort of contemporary cognitive science terms, something like this. The meaningful and important appears to you, shines to you as what you should focus your attention upon, and that directs your attention towards them. And that directed attention has been elicited by urgencies coming to you from being itself. And then the content of your life, consciousness, being decisions is directed and shaped by those, if I go to this way, radiating into your life of beings, right, of meanings. All of those are things which are ways in which being appropriates your awareness, appropriates your thought. And those he's calling them appropriatings because it has the character of directing, but it also has the character of afterwards feeling that you belong to them, right? It's not alienating. It's not that they're not yours, right? So he uses the terms of appropriating. He also uses the terms intimacy at times, because it's this character of it's a something that happens to me that is still mine.
And
Right.
is this kind of like opposite to nihilism, like when nothing happens to us, we are not cold, we are just free floating,
yes.
something like that?
Yes, but I think it's also in dramatic and intentional conscious opposition to Nietzsche. It's not will to power. It's not self-willing. It has the character of a directed belonging to, not a willful pressing out upon. Right? There is a notion that something like an attentive, thoughtful obedience to what you're called upon to attend to by your attention, that is an appropriate means of intellectual acting, so to speak. And that is the farthest thing from, I set myself a purpose that I use to climb up a ladder to become more capable of further purposes in a Nietzschean self-bootstrapping, pull myself out of the swamp, isn't will glorious manner, right? Now, Heidegger does think that these things, when they rise to the level of authenticity, become decisions. They become your own as decisions. They don't just happen to you, right? If you only passively undergo them without your own participation, you're not experiencing them authentically, something like that. So it's not that he's denying will in them, it's that their willfulness is the farthest thing from their essential character, right? And when he talks about violence, he talks about is when you substitute your own will for what being or attention demands, right? What being and attention demands is something like what's proper to the subject, what's proper to the reason why you're attending to it in the first place. And that's the farthest thing from a self-willing, I'll make it whatever I want it to be. That's why there's always foils here of machination, that's just trying to manipulate reality and twist it so that it gives you what you want, right? That to me is the thing that's being contrasted with here. That makes sense?
Yeah, will to power kind of in Nietzsche is both, it's subjective and also it's kind of like generic in a way, because everyone is following a will to power. And
yes, it's meant to be something which are everyone is doing. It's meant to be an underlying of life of, you can't help doing it, so go ahead and do it some more, harder, right? There's a place in the Bhagavad Gita where I think it is where the prince is reluctant to kill his enemies, and the destructive goddess says, I already condemned their death a long time ago, you're just executing the sentence, so go ahead, get on with it, right? And there's a self-excusing aspect of will to power in Nietzsche that's like that, of it's just life and nature that does this, therefore I should do it 10 times harder, something like that. And that's the farthest thing from the spirit I'm seeing in Heidegger here.
There is somewhere here where Heidegger says something about flattening and kind of universal stuff, and against them, of course.
Yes, we can talk about some of the other things he brought up as foils along the way, for sure. I wanted to talk about, we mentioned some of these essence things. I want to talk about the essence of truth is untruth. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I just want to make sure we covered it with enough thoroughness, because it's one of those things that can easily trip up people. Different schools of thought don't see what he's saying. This is on page 281, section 228. The essence of truth is untruth, which he's quoting from his own Origin of the Work of Art lecture. He says, deliberately formulated to be in conflict with itself is supposed to correct the fact that the negative belongs intrinsically to truth. By no means is sheer lack, but is resistance, as that self-concealing which comes into the clearing as such. By the original relation of truth of being as event is grasped. The statement is precarious because of the strangeness, etc. He says there's a reference towards the intimacy and strife in being itself as the event. What's going on here? He's using this deliberately paradoxical formula, which will, drive the truth is correctness people nutty, right? Because he's saying truth is error or something like that. But what he's not saying truth is error, and he's not saying it's non-correspondence. He's saying the essence of truth includes, if really the right way of saying it, includes the not yet seen. It includes the concealed. It includes the covered, right? Discovery requires things covered, right? And the covered over is part of the essence of discovery. In the same way, enlightenment requires the darkness against which the enlightenment happens, and truth as a shining requires the darkness in which it shines, right? So that's what he's trying to get at with this paradoxical formulation here. And I think it's fair to say most people, even if they accept that as sort of as a sort of Heraclitean, duality kind of necessity, might still see all the accent on the positive pole of that. He does not, right? He's at least as enamored of the background necessary mystery and the self-withdrawing, and there is something enticing about the mystery that hasn't been fathomed, right? It's not, he does not despair about the fact that there are things which are unknown, right? He loves questioning far too much for that, right? He's excited by the things that are not known, right? Okay, but anyway, that's why he talks about this in terms of intimacy and strife. Okay. I want to get to when he talks about the cave allegory, he is just pointing out that whereas the previous things on Plato were extremely critical, in 233, where he talks about the cave allegory, he is much more positive about it. He says that there's a lot more work to be done upon it. That's for sure. There's all kinds of things we could say about the cave allegory and what it means in terms of the Greek understanding of truth. The one thing I want to point out here is the way in which it shows that Plato has a different sense of semblance, a different sense of an opposite of truth, something like that. There's the opposite of concern with truth, which is he calls the distorted essence. I had to skip back for a second to 223. This is the place where he brought up the theater, right? The dissembling of the clearing, semblance of the essence. This assemblance can be driven to extreme externalization in the most superficial state and become mere spectacle, mere play acting. Theater, the structuring of reality, is the work of a set designer. If from time to time the theatrical comes to power, what does that say about the essence, right? So he's trying to claim there that there is something like a distorted essence of truth designated as errancy in that lecture, and he's tying that to the theatrical. He's tying that to the will to semblance, something like that, and he's calling that the distorted essence of truth. Now, first, I would put it to you that this is extremely common in Nietzsche. Nietzsche plays with this idea all the time. He talks about how everything deep loves a mask. He delights in dissembling. He delights in the spectacle. There is a playfulness about distorted essence of truth in Nietzsche that Heidegger is showing himself temperamentally very much against here, if I could put it that way, right? But there is a distaste for semblance in Plato too, but it's a different distaste directed perhaps at a different semblance. The semblance that Heidegger is reacting to here is a semblance that is a conscious dissembling, if I can put it that way, a conscious play acting, a covering over with an artifact and knowing that you're doing it. Whereas the semblance that Plato is most concerned about is the unconscious semblance of the cave, right? The being trapped in convention, something like that, whether you know without knowing it, or even if the people who are propounding those conventions don't know why they're doing so. There's a similar kind of distaste for semblance and sophistry in both, but there's a very different accent here. I don't know if you guys can hear it. When he's talking about distorted essence of truth, he's going to include in it things like truth is correctness, representation, the logical positivists, right? And put them together with play acting, right? You've got a different critique of the sophists, so to speak, than you have in Plato. That's what I'm trying to say. But I'm saying these foils play the same role for Heidegger in the theory he's propounding here that the sophists play in the Platonic corpus, right? They're the thinkers around who have it wrong, and because they are fascinated by semblance and the manipulability of semblance. Does that make sense to people? Okay. All right. Now, all that said, when we get to the question of truth in Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche, who is a person who famously says that truth is just a kind of error without which we cannot live, and has all of these sometimes this way, shallow positivist notions about the subject, if I can put it that way, as well as pragmatist notions about the subject, right? Gets this whole section in 234, and the substantive critique of the understanding of life that's going on here is deeply critical, right? He is deeply critical of what he takes Nietzsche to be doing here when he tries to take the subject pole, the subject object distinction in Hegel or something, and shove a life under it that is made the origin of everything subjective, something like that, but to which Nietzsche has the key, so he can unlock all of it. But then that is going to be the cause of all the illusions and distortions, but the illusions and distortions are to be embraced because they are alive, something like that. They are functions of life, right? And from everything we've seen before about the mission of truth and the dislike of Descartes, etc., you would expect Heidegger to be extremely critical of this here, right? But he is surprisingly gentle, is the way I would put it. He is surprisingly forgiving, right? He sees something like an actual commitment to or attraction to truth in Nietzsche in terms of his life and trajectory, even if it is not there in his positive doctrines, right? But it is clearly not there in his positive doctrines. Okay. So did people have reactions to this section?
Isn't it his appreciation for Nietzsche the fact that kind of he brought to an end everything? Like kind of, it's not like that he created something positive, but he put an end to it. And there is nothing you can do after that. And except maybe make room for Heidegger's new beginning.
I mean, does he though? Because I mean, from 10,000 feet, it looks like Nietzsche is stuck in the cul-de-sac, which is nowhere near Dasein, right? The furthest thing. So on page 287, second paragraph down, he says, what is made very difficult and almost impossible by Nietzsche's most proper thinking is the insight that the essential occurrence of truth means Dasein, i.e. standing in the midst of the clearing of what is self-concealing and drawing thence the ground and power of being human. For despite the evocations of perspectivism, truth remains rolled up in life, with life itself taken almost in the manner of a thing, as a center of will and power, which wills its own enhancement and surmounting. And then here's where he just jumps back to being incredibly sympathetic. He says, that transported standing out into the unknown, which certainly was a basic experience for Nietzsche, could not, in my view, if my view is correct, become the grounded core of his questioning, because tradition held him ensnared in the threefold way mentioned above, right? So he's willing to grant, although he's disagreeing with every aspect of where he arrives, to a basic experience of Nietzsche that he is heroically trying to philosophize into the unknown and discover and question. And for that, he is willing to forgive practically everything, right? But then he says he must not have understood the actual thing which is driving him, because it's better than his conclusions or something like that. He doesn't master his conception of the truth. He says, what is the meaning of all will to truth? And he calls this our problem, but his solution to it is that, and this is something which Heidegger isn't even fully explicit about here, that there is something in the will to truth which is anti-life in Nietzsche. And Heidegger is the farthest thing from that here. Heidegger would say that service to truth is pro-being, whether it's anti-life or not. And if it's pro-being, then anti-life, pro-life, who cares? That doesn't matter, right? It's not his standard. Nietzsche's standard is quite the opposite here. Nietzsche is, I'm thinking of especially in Beyond Good and Evil, is going to claim cynically that that some sort of nihilistic will is behind an enormous amount of will to truth. All right. Thank you, Pete. Thanks for joining us. Sorry, I realize it's very late over there. He's in Portugal now, so the hour is growing late. Hour is growing fairly late for us too, but I wanted to make sure that at least we got to the discussions of Nietzsche. To me, this is one of the standing mysteries in Heidegger. I think that he has an enormous amount of, there's an enormous amount that Nietzsche taught him, especially about the history of Western philosophy and about attitudes towards predecessors. And he admired the boldness of Nietzsche's thinking, something like that. But the conclusions he's coming to are, diametrically opposed to him, in point after point, but that never rises to the point of him having a dislike or disdain for him. Whereas whenever he refers to logical positivists, or even someone as close to him in thought as like a Dilthey, he will just slang them on every page, right? And that's striking to me. To me, it's a sign of a recognized intellectual parentage. He knows how much he learned from Nietzsche, and he's not willing to assassinate Father Parmenides, to put it in Platonic terms.
Isn't this also the period when he's kind of engaged with Nietzsche? And we know that every time he was engaged with an author, he was kind of sympathetic to that author during that period. And then maybe later he will turn more against Nietzsche.
Possibly, but I think only the first couple of years of the Nietzsche lectures are positive on Nietzsche. I mean, the later ones are incredibly, they're some of the most penchant, attacks on Nietzsche ever written, right? The things in third volume of the Nietzsche series are, it's as comprehensive a takedown as there is. And it's also situating him entirely within this structure of metaphysics that Heidegger himself is attacking. So there are places in the earlier lectures on him, I agree, when he's more sympathetic, but by the time he's writing this, no, I don't think he's that sympathetic. I don't think that's the reason. I think it's intellectual lineage, parentage, how much he learned from him, that is leading him to, cut him all the slack for being a philosopher by temperament, for being someone who wondered and questioned. And, okay. The last thing I want to talk about is, at least before I get to the last few questions, is this last section on belief and truth. And I want to ask other people what they made of it first before I give my own reading of it. The first point I point out there is that he will say that from the standpoint of the notion of truth as correspondence or truth as certainty, everything I'm saying here about the experience of the essence of truth will not sound like truth, it will sound like belief, right? What did folks make of this section? I had a discussion with someone another night who said that the evidence of things unseen is the same as saying the evidence of things without evidence, which is the same as saying, what we know not to be true, the case, or something like that, right? Is there an element of that here? Belief, deeming true what utterly withdraws from all knowledge.
Yeah, that certainly resembles Nietzsche, because Nietzsche argues you can't look to reason or morality to understand life. So that was one of the key points I think Heidegger kept with his interest in Nietzsche's work.
Possibly. Nietzsche tends to be much more down on belief, though, than I would find Heidegger to be here, right? Heidegger says, this knowledge is then not deeming true just something or other that happens to be true, or even something permanently true. Instead, it is originally an abiding in the essence of truth. this knowledge, essential knowledge, then more original than any belief. The latter are merely concerned with something true. Therefore, if belief is ever to escape utter blindness, must indeed necessarily know what it means to be true and to be a truth. Essential knowledge is the abiding of the essence. So he's trying to say something like, knowing or believing both rest on something which is knowing truth in this more basic sense, but that knowing truth in this more basic sense, you will concede by the end of the passage, looks more like belief to those in the other traditions than like knowledge. Instead, this belief is persistence in the extreme decision. So from his own point of view, it's not adequately described as a belief, and it's also not adequately described as a knowledge. It's more like a mission and a choice.
Isn't this going back to his project of a leap? And we need to kind of, it's a more like a belief. You need to believe in it too, and then to be persistent.
Yes, this
and
is my point.
To jump into it and.
Agreed. So then on top of 272, I think that's what he's saying, right? Questioners of this kind are the original and proper believers. Those in a radical way take seriously truth itself, not only what is true, and in place up for decision the question of whether the essence of truth essentially occurs, whether essential occurrence bears and leads us, right? In short, the historical ones. So the questioners are the believers who take truth seriously, right? Okay, this comes right after the section on Nietzsche. He's saying that Nietzsche, as the questioner who took truth seriously, is the proper believer. I put it to you that he is not. He's at least making a distinction between himself and Nietzsche here. The critical thing for him is as questioning. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I'm sorry, Jason, could this be similar to what we read about St. Paul and living the time of the Parousia, where we behave and our life is lived in this way, not expectation, not a false living, but our time is our life, and which is based a little bit on belief as truth, truth as belief, or not? Tell me.
So I think that there is similarity there in the sense that he is definitely making this practical dislodgement appeal of make the leap into this way of looking at things, this way of thinking of things, and this mission, right? That part I think is exactly equivalent to what you're talking about. The curious thing here is that he's the one who brings up the relation of this to belief. And the way in which I read this section is he's trying to say something like, I kind of don't care if the positivists denounce me as a believer, and I kind of want to snatch away from the religious believers the crown that they're the ones who believe things, because the reason I believe things is I question them. And if you don't question them, you're not really believing anything, because questioning and believing is the way you take the truth seriously. So the believers that don't question aren't adequate for him, and the people who demand evidence for everything believed are too cautious and not venturing enough for him. He wants a questioner who sticks their neck out. Does that make sense? I'm talking about just temperament here.
Yes, it does. Thank you. May I say something about my
Please.
understanding of Heidegger's use of the word disposition and comportment?
Yes.
It came to me about a few months ago, the way people talk today, many people, especially in my family, they use the word like. Oh, and I was like, have you heard people who talk that way?
Sure.
Well, I thought I would analyze what exactly this phenomena is. And just to give you a sentence, let's say I went to I saw this new house and I looked at it and I went into the room and I'm like, I'm out of here. Okay, I started this sentence discursively, but then what happened was that I lost the discursiveness. Had I continued discursively, I would have said, I got into the room and I felt I didn't like it, so I left. I would say something like that, but I didn't say that. I said, like, I'm out of here. So in my insight, on this matter, it seems to me that this is exactly what Heidegger means by compartment and attitude and disposition. In other words, I am one who, faced with this reality, faced with these facts, I comport myself in this way. I have to leave. In other words, you see what I'm trying to say? There's a
I
difference
do, but
between bringing.
I have I do understand, but I have a quite different reaction to that manner of speaking, if you get me, which is
Sure.
I think that there's an appeal in that like to an assumed commonality with the listener who is expecting the thing following the like, which may be a cliche, to resonate with them. And to me, that's very much appealing to a they. It's very much appealing to a common. And it's not appealing to a personal, to a individual. The like is an attempt to get the other person to understand your reactions to your unique situation on an analogy to other reactions they may have felt in other analogous situations. And the transporting comparativeness of that is, to me, an appeal to an analogy, an appeal to a each of us can see that this aspect of our lives is like each other because they're like this third thing that is like what the cliche is about, or something like that. And to me, this is what it is the farthest thing from is personal, embodied, authentically my own testimony, right? It's in that regard, it is not about the thing which uniquely only I could feel in this room, right? And it's exactly trying to divorce itself from any such situating and therefore exposed personalness. It's trying to shelter it in a common, we've all felt this, we all can see this, that is, to me, a running into a common. It's a running into a they. Does that make
I
sense?
agree with you. Yes, yes, I agree with you. But no, I do, because again, I don't want to bring Dante in here because this is one of the links I have with the similarity between Dante and Heidegger. But I do think my point stands as bracketed, and I agree. It is calling, it is demanding the affinity of the listener to
Yes.
relate to what you're saying. But
Yes.
Jason, doesn't Heidegger do the same when he wants us to experience? He puts these statements open so that we will take the step and experience.
He does
What do you
want us
think?
to. He does want us to share an experience, but he's doing that by trying to point to. He wants us to recapitulate an experience he has had, but he's trying to do that even in the most difficult and abstract ways, and even the most challenging ways. He's not trying to make it easy on us. Honestly, he's often very challenging that way. So the other part that
Yes.
I'll agree with you though, is that Heidegger, as I said a little earlier, I mean, several, I don't know, an hour ago or something, Heidegger is very much about the notion that attunement and mood and so forth give you ways of knowing or experiencing which are independent of, or, more basic than at times your conscious ratiocination, so to speak. And when he talks about the fundamental mood of restraint that's involved in the attitude he's talking about here, whenever all the previous chapters he began with, what fundamental mood is involved in this, right? He recurs to that because he does think that those are basic, those are attunements, those are, and I'm agreeing with you with that part of it, that they're I don't know that the particular experience of the phrase of like is an appeal to that, but the fact that there is being experienced information in such pre-rational attunements, if pre-rational is the right word, more basic attunements, something like that. Heidegger is all over that. He has been since being in time. It's definitely still here. It's woven into his method that he begins every chapter with talking about those basic attunements. Yeah. Sorry, there was one other thing. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Isabel.
No,
Sorry.
I'm just saying that I have to go too. I'm so sorry. I'll
Okay.
catch
Yes.
you
Okay.
at the end of the. I'll catch you the YouTube. Thank you,
Okay.
everybody.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Good questions as usual. There was one other thing I wanted to remark on, and this is more of it's almost a joke in passing, but there's one place where he says you cannot criticize a projection for being for not corresponding or being incorrect or something like that. And there's a sense in which this is, it makes a certain clear sense that, a projection, if it's a projection on almost possibilities, is more like a future decision about a potential for oneself, something like that. It is testimony about attentions and so on are involved in it. And in that sense, it is obtuse to complain that this projection is incorrect, right? Okay, can accept surface level of the saying. But I also think it's a little bit fast and loose. I think that there are projections that suffer from incorrectness in practical senses, both in the inappropriatenesses in the way that Heidegger would talk about it of X or Y is needful or necessary, he likes to say, but doesn't actually have to happen. So it's not necessary in the logical or classical sense, and aren't acted upon. There's all kinds of things which there's the possibility of critique of comportments that way. Heidegger himself is critiquing the comportment of being away all the time, right? Of being lost in the day all the time. So I think that that passing comment can be taken too far. The other thing I just noticed reading it is I was thinking of very practical comportments. And I remember some of the things he talked about, the difference between fear and anxiety and being in time. The things that we fear based upon a projection. The projection better be accurate or the fear is not going to be a useful guide, right? You do not want to not have fear as you stand before a pattern of orange and black stripes and think that you have 20 minutes to contemplate the paintbrushes if it's a tiger, right? Your projection had better be accurate. And I think that there's a short selling of the pragmatists in that comment. Anyway, I was just, as I said, it's almost an aside, almost a joke, because I was just struck by this thing about, it's obtuse to criticize a projection as incorrect. Not always. Sometimes it's perfectly fine. Anyway, I want to give people a chance for their final questions or remarks. And then I'm going to remind in the next section.
Yeah, I just had a point I wanted to make. It's
Sure.
interesting that, Heidegger was very well aware that Nietzsche was talking about being creative as the way forward, empowering the will and being creative. And Heidegger is arguing there's something else that's creative, maybe the openness of truth. And I'm just wondering, does he articulate this really well? Because, he talks about art, and that is someone being creative. But he's more interested in how we receive the art rather than creating it.
He cares about the creating too. I mean, he talks about creativity on most of the page of the section we were just on. The other place that it really came up was in the earlier section where he was talking about the difference between mastery and violence, where mastery is something like the confident choosing of the things which are free and could be otherwise, but you're letting them, the actual choices made about them, be directed by what the situation or work demands, something like that, which is along the lines of, the artist sees that the line has to go thus, right? Of course, it's free. He could draw it anyway, but if he draws it the other ways, he knows that they're wrong. And this is the sign of mastery, that there is in something which is to anyone else a free choice, there's a way it really needs to be that is dictated by the task before us. And that is what he says, Heidegger says, real creativity with mastery is like. I'm trying to find this passage. but he's contrasting that with the thinking that a free choice means you can make it anything you want it to be, and they will all work just as well because they're just an expression of your preference or something like that. And that he calls violence. It is departing from what the occasion demands in a way that can, it can mimic creativity, but it will not speak to the others for whom the work is directed, because it will not speak with them, will not grab them, it will not last. And it's really an attempt to twist and manipulate rather than an attempt to unveil and convey. And it is the opposite of mastery for him. So he does speak about creativity, and it is a valued word for him, but he does not think of creativity as having this anything goes free character. Instead, it has a dictated by what the work or purpose requires character. Does that help?
Yeah, because I think Nietzsche doesn't really, well, maybe he makes that distinction, but Nietzsche was just arguing people just need to be more creative. But Heidegger's saying there's a level of creativity that may be beyond our skills, and we need to be aware of that.
I don't know that he talks about a creativity beyond our skills. I mean, the difference is Heidegger sees something like a disposition to obedient receiving in the highest creativity that Nietzsche does not see there. Nietzsche sees a free choice, thus it shall be, my way. He wants the self-command accent on creativity. There is a rivalry with past understandings of creators in Nietzsche and past promulgators of laws in Nietzsche that wants to equal or excel them in self-consciousness, exceed them in breadth, something like that. And there is a desire to outdo the previous in the creativity angle in Nietzsche. There's also a obeying only yourself aspect. He doesn't like the idea of obedience to hires. He doesn't think the hires are hires. He thinks they're somebody else's projection of their own lower, if you can put it that way. And as their own, it's not yours, right? So, and this is probably most apparent in things like Zarathustra era Nietzsche. And he talks about, I want your creations not to reach beyond your creative will, etc. But anyway, there's definite temperamental differences there, and the biggest temperamental difference I see between them is that a dutiful following of what is proper to the occasion, obedient like listening, is there in Heidegger's understanding of good creativity and mastery, and that accent is completely antithetical to Nietzsche's spirit in such things, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think he would. I'm just guessing, but he associates that with Western metaphysics, where he sees in Eastern metaphysics and Zen philosophy a better way towards mastery and creativity. That's just my guess.
And that's fair. I think that same sense of what the occasion demands is there in both Taoism and Buddhism in a way that it isn't in the more willful Faustian man you get in the German idealists in general. Faustian man is to speak Spengler, for those who know. Okay, it's the idea that Goethe's Faust is like a paradigm or ideal type of the hero in the West is the idea. All right, I want to briefly go over what we're going to do for next time in case people forgot or weren't here for it. First of all, the next session is going to be on September the 8th at the same time, place, etc. And we're going to finish off all of part 5. That's time, space is the abyssal ground, and the essential occurrence of truth is sheltering, along with all of parts 6 and 7, the future ones and the last God. So that takes us all the way to the beginning of part 8 on being. So that's, despite the number of sections involved, that's only like 42 pages, something like that. or 40 pages. So anyway, that's the from the remainder of part 5, all of 6 and 7 for next time. And then we'll have other sections after that for part 8 being. So that's the plan. I'll have this discussion up on YouTube later tonight. Any other comments before I stop recording? All right, we're good then. I will stop.